Carl Jung explained, 9 spiritual signs men carry silent wounds that shape their destiny. There's a secret that culture desperately wants to keep from you. It's not hidden in ancient texts or esoteric teachings. It's buried in something far more fundamental, in the very definition of what it means to be a man. Carl Jung discovered something that changed everything he understood about masculine psychology. He found that what we call masculinity isn't natural at all. It's a wound response, a psychological adaptation to systematic trauma that begins in boyhood and determines every relationship, every career choice, every moment of silent desperation that men experience but can never name. Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because this truth has been suppressed for a reason. Society needs men's wounds to remain invisible. It needs men to stay unconscious, driven by forces they don't understand, motivated by pain they can't acknowledge. Because conscious, healed men cannot be manipulated through shame. They cannot be controlled through the promise of proving their worth. They cannot be weaponized through their terror of appearing weak. Jung wrote this in his private journals, words that wouldn't be published until after his death. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. He understood why. Because to accept yourself completely as a man means confronting a horrifying truth. That almost everything you were taught about masculinity was designed to disconnect you from your own soul. Here's what Jung discovered. By the time most boys reach adolescence, they've undergone a systematic psychological amputation. They've been progressively severed from essential aspects of their humanity: emotional expression, vulnerability, relational depth, creative play, gentleness, receptivity, and told that these amputated parts are feminine and therefore forbidden. What remains is a fragment of a human being, operating from a rigid persona that Jung called the mask of masculinity, covering a wounded, underdeveloped inner world that will unconsciously control every major decision for the rest of their lives. This isn't a metaphor. This is the architecture of masculine suffering that Jung mapped with surgical precision. And here's the part that will change how you see your entire life. These wounds don't just cause pain, they create destiny. Jung's principle was absolute and unforgiving. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Your silent wounds, the ones you learned to hide so well that even you forgot they existed, are right now, in this moment, determining who you love, how you work, what you fear, and what you'll never allow yourself to become. There are 9 spiritual signs that reveal these wounds, 9 patterns that Jung identified across decades of working with men who appeared successful, strong, and together on the outside while dying slowly on the inside. If you recognize even 3 of these signs in yourself, you're living an unconscious destiny shaped by childhood trauma you've never processed. And here's why this matters more than anything else you'll hear today. You have approximately 30,000 days on this earth if you're lucky. Right now, you're spending those days acting out wounds you didn't even know you carried. You're repeating patterns you think are choices but are actually compulsions. You're living someone else's script, your father's unlived dreams, your mother's unmet needs, culture's demands, while your authentic self remains locked in the basement of your psyche, waiting for you to finally come find it. This isn't self-help. This isn't therapy. This is initiation into a truth that Jung knew would sound insane to most people. Your wounds are not random. They form a coherent pattern that's been directing your life from the shadows. And the moment you make that pattern conscious, the moment you can finally see the invisible architecture of your pain, everything changes. Not because the wounds disappear, but because when wounds become conscious, destiny becomes choice. I'm going to show you something that most men will never see. The 9 signs that reveal you're carrying silent wounds that have become your unconscious fate. But I need to warn you, once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. Once you recognize how your entire life has been shaped by childhood pain you never processed, there's no going back to comfortable unconsciousness. Some of you will watch this and feel nothing but defensive dismissal. That's the wound protecting itself. Some of you will feel rage rising in your chest. That's the guardian emotion that's been protecting deeper, more vulnerable feelings you've spent decades avoiding. Some of you will feel a strange sense of relief, like someone just described the haunting you thought only you experienced. That's consciousness beginning. Jung understood that this work is dangerous, not because it's complicated, but because it requires what the masculine code absolutely forbids. Admitting you're wounded, asking for help, feeling what you've spent your life avoiding. Most men would rather die than do this work, and some do. Suicide rates among men, particularly middle-aged men, reveal the brutal cost of wounds that remain forever silent. But here's the promise I can make you, the same promise Jung made to the men who came to him, desperate and broken. Your wounds are not your weakness. They're not evidence that you failed at being a man. They're the psyche's desperate attempt to communicate what was taken from you, what you had to sacrifice to survive, what you'll need to reclaim to actually live. Every wound contains a message. Every pattern reveals a truth. Every symptom you've been trying to suppress through willpower, achievement, substances, or control is actually guidance. Your soul trying to show you the path back to yourself. Are you ready to see what you've been refusing to look at? Are you willing to confront the invisible forces that have been determining your destiny? Can you handle the truth about why you struggle to feel, why your relationships fail in predictable ways, why success never feels like enough, why rage lives just beneath your skin, why you're so profoundly lonely despite being surrounded by people? Then let's descend. Let's go into the forbidden territory that masculine conditioning teaches men to avoid at all costs. Let's discover what Jung found when he had the courage to look at masculine psychology without the comforting lies that culture uses to keep men unconscious and compliant. The 9 signs are waiting. Your wounds are ready to be seen. And your authentic destiny, the one you've been unconsciously fleeing your entire life, is on the other side of this confrontation. Let's begin with the problem that creates all the others. Before we can understand the 9 signs, you need to see the invisible system that creates them, because these wounds don't emerge randomly. They're the predictable outcome of a process that Jung recognized as catastrophic to masculine development, the systematic psychological amputation that every boy undergoes in his transformation into a man. Picture a boy at age 4 or 5. If you watch him carefully before the world has fully gotten to him, you'll see something remarkable. Emotional fluidity that would be considered pathological in most adult men. He cries easily when hurt or afraid. He laughs with his entire body. He expresses affection openly, climbing into laps, reaching for hugs, declaring love without embarrassment. He speaks his truth directly. I'm scared. I'm sad. I don't like that. He's creative in ways that don't serve any productive purpose, building blanket forts, creating imaginary worlds, dancing for the pure joy of movement. He's gentle with animals and younger children. He's receptive to emotional currents around him, sensing when mommy is sad or daddy is angry. In other words, he's a complete human being, integrated, whole, what Jung would call connected to the self, that deep center of authentic being that exists before social conditioning fragments us into acceptable personas. Now, watch what happens over the next 10 years. The amputation begins almost immediately, but it accelerates dramatically once he starts school and enters the brutal laboratory of masculine socialization called the peer group. Every time he cries, he's told directly or indirectly, "Big boys don't cry. Stop being such a baby. Man up. Are you a girl?" Every time he expresses fear, he learns it invites attack. Other boys smell weakness the way sharks smell blood. Every time he seeks physical affection after a certain age, he notices the withdrawal, the discomfort, the subtle message that male bodies touching is suspicious, potentially pathological. Every time he expresses gentleness, creativity, or emotional sensitivity, he risks the most devastating label in the masculine economy. "You're acting like a girl," which he quickly learns means you're acting like something contemptible, inferior, weak, something that invites violence. This isn't theory. Researchers who study masculine socialization have documented this process with heartbreaking precision. Boys learn by age 7 or 8 that the masculine code is absolute. Emotions are weakness. Vulnerability invites attack. Asking for help is admitting failure. Physical and emotional pain must be endured in silence, and masculine worth is measured solely by strength, achievement, and control. What does this mean psychologically? It means that essential capacities are progressively severed from the developing masculine psyche. By adolescence, most boys have lost access to their emotional range. They can feel anger and mild contentment, but the full spectrum of human feeling, grief, fear, tenderness, joy, vulnerability, becomes increasingly inaccessible. They've lost the capacity for emotional intimacy, the ability to be known deeply and to know others beyond surface performance. They've lost connection to their bodies beyond using them instrumentally for sports or work. They've lost access to creative expression that doesn't serve achievement. They've lost the ability to ask for help or admit struggle without experiencing it as humiliating weakness. This is what Jung meant by psychological amputation. These aren't capacities that atrophy from lack of use. They're abilities that are actively attacked, shamed, and punished until the boy learns to exile them from consciousness entirely. He doesn't just stop expressing emotions, he stops being able to feel them. He doesn't just avoid vulnerability, he becomes incapable of it. He doesn't just hide his wounds, he forgets he has them. What takes the place of this amputated humanity? Jung called it the persona, the social mask, the false self, the carefully constructed performance of masculinity that conceals the wounded, underdeveloped interior. By young adulthood, most men have developed a rigid persona that looks like strength but functions as armor. It protects them from the vulnerability that brought pain, but it also imprisons them in a half-life, cut off from their own depths and from genuine connection with others. But here's what makes this truly catastrophic. The persona is mistaken for the self. Men come to believe that the mask is who they are. The performance becomes their identity. The wounded boy beneath, with his pain, his longing, his terror, his unmet needs, he's exiled to the unconscious, where he remains frozen at the age he was wounded, running the man's life from the shadows. Now let me show you where these wounds come from specifically, because understanding the origin points is essential to recognizing how they're operating in your life right now. The father wound. The first and most profound source of masculine wounding comes from fathers. Jung himself carried devastating father wounds. His own father was a depressed, failed pastor who lost his faith but continued performing religious duties out of obligation. Young Carl experienced his father as spiritually dead, emotionally unavailable, and incapable of authentic masculine presence. This created Jung's lifelong hunger for father figures and his desperate search for strong male mentors, first in Sigmund Freud, then ultimately in confronting his own internal authority. The father wound manifests in multiple forms, each creating specific destiny patterns. The absent father, whether through death, divorce, abandonment, or emotional unavailability, creates a void at the center of masculine identity. The boy grows into a man who spends his life seeking father substitutes, bosses, mentors, older men who might finally give him the approval, guidance, and blessing his father never provided. He never feels internally anchored, always looking outside himself for masculine validation. This wound creates men who remain eternal boys, never quite becoming their own authority, always seeking permission from father figures to fully inhabit their lives. The critical father wounds through impossible standards and constant disapproval. No matter what the boy achieves, it's never quite enough. The A- should have been an A. The championship should have been won more dominantly. The career success is admirable but falls short of the father's expectations. This wound creates internalized shame around masculine adequacy. The boy becomes a man who achieves compulsively but can never feel successful, who pushes himself mercilessly because the critical father has become the voice in his head, who secretly believes he's inadequate no matter what external evidence suggests otherwise. The violent or raging father wounds through terror. The boy never knows when the explosion will come, learns to walk on eggshells, develops hypervigilance around masculine anger. This wound creates two patterns. Either the man replicates the violence, becoming the raging father to his own children, or he becomes the opposite, conflict avoidant, unable to access healthy anger, terrified of his own power because he knows what masculine rage can do. The weak or passive father wounds through absence of strength. Maybe he was dominated by the mother, depressed and withdrawn, or simply incapable of providing protection, guidance, or masculine modeling. The boy experiences his father as powerless, which creates a complex wound. Contempt for masculine vulnerability mixed with terror of his own potential weakness. This often produces men who overcompensate with aggressive masculinity, terrified of ever appearing weak like their fathers. The abandoning father wounds through rejection and departure. Through death, divorce, or simply choosing to leave, the father communicates the devastating message, "You're not worth staying for." This creates core wounds around masculine unworthiness. If my own father didn't find me valuable enough to stay, what does that say about my fundamental worth? Men with this wound often unconsciously test relationships, expecting abandonment, sometimes even creating it through self-sabotage to prove their deepest belief. Eventually, everyone leaves. The second major source comes from mothers, though this wound is less acknowledged in masculine psychology because admitting mother wounds feels like betraying someone who typically provided primary care and love. But Jung understood that mothers can wound in profound ways, not through malice, but through their own unmet needs and unconscious patterns. The enmeshed mother wound comes from a mother who uses her son for emotional fulfillment that should come from adult relationships. She makes him her confidant, her emotional support, sometimes her substitute husband. The boy learns to attune to her moods, meet her emotional needs, and maintain intimate connection that becomes suffocating. This creates men who either flee all intimacy, terrified of being swallowed again, or unconsciously seek mother substitutes in romantic partners, remaining boys seeking mommy rather than men capable of partnership. The critical or controlling mother wounds through constant judgment and micromanagement. She knows better how he should dress, speak, behave, think, and feel. She criticizes his choices, his friends, his interests, his very being as never quite acceptable. This creates either rebellion, compulsive defiance of all feminine authority, or submission. Men who remain boys seeking female approval, unable to trust their own judgment. The seductive mother wound, and this is delicate territory, comes from inappropriate emotional or physical intimacy that sexualizes the mother-son relationship. This doesn't necessarily mean overt abuse, but rather boundary violations. Walking in on him naked beyond childhood, comments about his body, emotional intensity that feels romantic rather than maternal, using him as emotional substitute for absent father. This creates profound confusion around feminine energy, sexuality, and intimacy. Men with this wound often develop the Madonna whore complex, inability to be fully sexual with women they respect or love, only able to experience passion with women they deem bad or inappropriate. The abandoning or rejecting mother wounds through emotional absence or actual departure, whether through death, mental illness, addiction, or simply emotional unavailability. The mother who can't provide consistent presence and affection creates wounds around trust, abandonment, and worthiness of love. Men with this wound often unconsciously choose emotionally unavailable partners, repeating the mother dynamic, or they become controlling in relationships, terrified of abandonment. The third source comes from the brutal masculine peer culture that boys navigate from elementary school onward. This is where the masculine code is enforced, with savage precision through bullying, competition, and constant testing. Any deviation from narrow masculine norms invites attack. Being too emotional, too sensitive, too creative, too gentle, too interested in girl things, too close with male friends, too physically weak, too academically focused, too anything that doesn't fit the rigid template. Boys who are bullied, and research shows that most boys experience significant bullying, learn that the world is dangerous, that showing vulnerability invites destruction, that you're on your own, that you must be strong enough to protect yourself or you'll be consumed. Even boys who aren't bullied witness it and learn the lesson. This is what happens when you're weak, different, vulnerable. Better to hide any such qualities, better to join the bullies than risk becoming the target. Better to perform aggressive masculinity than express your actual self. The peer wound creates men who struggle with male friendships, maintaining only superficial drinking buddy relationships while starving for actual intimacy with other men. It creates men who experience all relationships as competitive or potentially hostile. It creates men who can never truly relax because they learned that constant vigilance is the price of masculine survival. The fourth source is culture itself, the ocean of masculine messaging from media, religion, economics, and social institutions that defines what real men are and ruthlessly punishes deviation. Media representations of masculinity: strong, silent, emotionally restricted, sexually aggressive, always in control, solving problems through force or dominance, never asking for help, never showing fear beyond brief moments before triumphant victory. Religion teaching that men are leaders, providers, authorities, who must never appear weak and whose value comes through sacrifice and service. Economic systems demanding that men define their worth through providing, achieving, accumulating, measuring masculine value by income, title, and possessions. This cultural programming becomes internalized as the superego, the voice of authority that judges you constantly against impossible masculine ideals. You're not man enough if you cry. You're not man enough if you're not the breadwinner. You're not man enough if you ask for help. You're not man enough if you're not always strong, always capable, always in control. The cultural wound creates men who exhaust themselves, trying to meet standards that are psychologically impossible, measuring themselves against images of masculinity that are actually trauma responses disguised as strength. Now here's where Jung's insight becomes devastating. By the time most boys reach adulthood, these four sources of wounding have created what appears to be normal masculine psychology, but is actually a constellation of trauma responses that will determine every major life outcome. The man emerges into adulthood carrying wounds he cannot name because naming them would require the emotional capacity that was amputated. He's disconnected from his interior world because accessing it would mean feeling what he was taught to avoid. He's trapped in a rigid persona because dropping it would expose the vulnerable boy beneath who was shamed, criticized, abandoned, or attacked. And here's the brutal truth that Jung documented relentlessly. These wounds don't just cause psychological pain, they create destiny. What does this mean practically? It means the man with father wounds unconsciously, seeks father approval in every boss, becoming the overachieving employee who can never satisfy the internalized critical father, sabotaging his own advancement when it approaches the level his father never reached, or rebelling against legitimate authority because all authority reminds him of the father who wounded him. The man with mother wounds unconsciously chooses partners who recreate his mother dynamic, enmeshed women who try to control him, emotionally unavailable women he can pursue but never reach, critical women whose approval he desperately seeks while resenting their judgment, or seductive women who blur the line between romance and maternal care. The man with peer wounds unconsciously maintains surface friendships while starving for real connection, experiences other men as threats or competitors, and withdraws from any situation that might expose vulnerability, because vulnerability in the presence of other males feels like mortal danger. The man with cultural wounds drives himself toward exhaustion, trying to achieve enough, earn enough, accomplish enough, to finally feel like a real man, never recognizing that the standards are impossible and the wound is unfillable through external achievement. Jung's principle was absolute. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Your relationship failures, not bad luck or wrong partners, unconscious wound patterns determining who you choose and how you relate. Your career being simultaneously successful and unfulfilling, not circumstance. Wounds driving you toward achievement to prove worth rather than toward authentic calling that expresses your soul. Your emotional restriction and relationship distance, not natural masculine temperament. Trauma response to developmental wounding that made emotions dangerous and vulnerability threatening. The 9 signs I'm about to reveal are the specific manifestations of this systematic wounding. They're not character flaws, they're not evidence that you're broken or weak. They're the predictable outcomes of psychological amputation, the ways that wounds become visible in behavior, relationship patterns, and life choices. But here's what makes this knowledge both painful and liberating. When wounds become conscious, they lose their power to determine your destiny. The moment you can see the pattern, you're no longer completely trapped in it. The moment you can name the wound, you're no longer entirely controlled by it. Jung discovered that men who had the courage to confront their wounds, to descend into the denied interior, to feel what they'd been avoiding, to grieve what was lost, to integrate what was amputated, emerged as fundamentally different beings. Not men who had overcome weakness, but men who had become whole. Not men who had conquered vulnerability, but men who had integrated it into a larger, more authentic strength. This is what he meant by individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than what you were conditioned to become. And it requires doing exactly what masculine conditioning forbids: admitting you're wounded, asking for help, feeling deeply, being vulnerable, surrendering the protective mask, and facing the truth about how your childhood pain has been determining your adult life. Are you willing to look? Can you handle seeing how the wounds you carry have been writing your life story from the shadows? Because once you see it, once you recognize the invisible architecture of pain that's been controlling your relationships, your career, your emotional life, your very identity. You can never go back to comfortable unconsciousness. The 9 signs are the map to your wounding. Let's discover what they reveal about the life you've been living and the destiny you've been unconsciously acting out. Before I reveal the 9 signs systematically, I need you to meet someone, because these patterns aren't abstractions. They're lived experiences that shape real human lives in devastating ways. Let me tell you about James. When James first walked into the Jungian analyst's office, he looked like everything masculine culture tells us to aspire to. 47 years old, executive vice president at a tech company, earning 7 figures, physically fit despite his demanding schedule, impeccably dressed in the armor of corporate success. His handshake was firm, his eye contact steady, his demeanor controlled and competent. He apologized for taking the appointment time, explaining efficiently that his doctor had insisted after a minor incident, and his lawyer thought therapy might be useful for some personal matters he was dealing with. The therapist, Dr. Margaret Chen, a skilled Jungian analyst, noted something immediately. James's entire presentation was a performance. The handshake was practiced. The eye contact was manufactured. The confident demeanor was a mask stretched so tight across his face that it looked like it might crack. She could see the exhaustion beneath the performance, the desperation behind the competence, the terror underneath the control. It took 3 sessions before James could say it out loud. "I tried to kill myself 6 weeks ago." The admission came with no emotion, delivered in the same controlled executive tone he used to discuss quarterly earnings. His doctor had put him on medical leave after James broke down in the ER, where he'd been taken after his girlfriend found him unconscious from an intentional overdose of sleeping pills mixed with vodka. The personal matters his lawyer was worried about. James's second ex-wife was seeking a restraining order after a confrontation where he'd punched a wall inches from her face during an argument about custody arrangements with his 17-year-old son. His first ex-wife had already gotten one 3 years prior after he'd thrown a laptop across the room during a Zoom call, nearly hitting their daughter. James's son had stopped speaking to him entirely. His daughter would only communicate through lawyers. His current girlfriend was taking space to evaluate the relationship after the suicide attempt. And James sat in the analyst's office, looking like a man whose life had just imploded, describing it all in the flat, disconnected tone of someone reporting on the weather. "I don't understand what happened," James said, his voice finally cracking on the edges. "I did everything right. I built the career. I provided for everyone. I achieved the success. How did I end up here?" Over the next 2 years of intensive analysis, Dr. Chen and James would map the invisible architecture of pain that had been determining every major decision of his life, an architecture built in childhood, calcified in adolescence, and operating from complete unconsciousness until his suicide attempt forced a crack in the armored persona he'd spent 47 years constructing. Let me take you into James's story, because within it, you'll see the 9 signs manifesting in a real human life, creating the unconscious destiny that Jung warned about. James's father was a military officer, Army colonel, veteran of 2 wars, carrier of his own unprocessed trauma that he believed real men simply endured in silence. From James's earliest memories, his father was a towering, intimidating presence who ruled the household through criticism, impossible standards, and sudden eruptions of rage that terrified everyone into compliance. James remembered the rules with crystalline clarity even 40 years later. Men don't cry. Men don't complain. Men solve problems. They don't have them. Emotions are weakness, and weakness is contemptible. A man's worth is measured by his achievements, his ability to provide, his control over himself and his environment. Nothing James did was ever quite good enough. The A- should have been an A. The baseball championship would have been more impressive if he'd hit more home runs. The college scholarship was expected, not celebrated. But the wound that would shape James's entire life happened when he was 9 years old. He came home from school one day to find his parents in a screaming argument, his father's face red with rage, his mother backing away toward the kitchen. James watched, frozen in the doorway, as his father shoved his mother against the counter, his hand raised as if to strike. His mother saw James and screamed, "Your son is watching you!" His father turned, looked at James with pure fury, then strode out of the house, slamming the door so hard the pictures rattled on the walls. When he came back hours later, he found James crying in his room. His father stood in the doorway and said, voice dripping with contempt, "Stop crying like a little girl. Real men don't fall apart because of a little family disagreement. What are you, weak?" James tried to stop crying, but the tears kept coming, terror and confusion and helplessness pouring out despite his desperate attempts at control. His father shook his head in disgust and left. For the next week, he wouldn't speak to James, wouldn't look at him, acted as if his son didn't exist. The message was absolute. Emotions make you contemptible. Vulnerability invites rejection. And if you're not strong enough to control yourself, you're not worthy of love. James learned his lesson. He never cried in front of his father again, never showed fear or sadness or any emotion that might bring that devastating contempt and withdrawal. By age 11, he could take harsh criticism without flinching. By 13, he'd mastered the same controlled, competent demeanor his father wore like armor. By 15, he'd learned to use anger, the only acceptable masculine emotion, to cover everything else he might feel. What James couldn't see, what he wouldn't see for 32 more years, until Dr. Chen helped him excavate this memory and feel its full impact, was that in that moment he'd made an unconscious decision that would determine his entire destiny. I will never be vulnerable again. I will be strong, controlled, and successful enough that I never have to feel powerless again. I will become everything my father demands, so I never have to experience his contempt again. This decision created the architecture of James's life. Every major choice, every relationship, every career move, every moment of his existence for the next 3 decades was unconsciously designed to fulfill that 9-year-old boy's desperate vow. James became exactly what his father demanded: extraordinarily successful, rigidly controlled, emotionally invulnerable. He was valedictorian in high school, went to Stanford on full scholarship, graduated top of his class, joined a tech startup that exploded into a major company where he climbed ruthlessly to executive leadership. He made decisions with calculated precision, worked 18-hour days without complaint, outperformed every peer through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. Everyone who worked with James saw the same thing: a machine of competence and achievement. Colleagues admired him. Competitors feared him. His father, before his death from a heart attack when James was 35, finally offered something approximating approval. You turned out all right, made something of yourself. But in Dr. Chen's office, James finally admitted what he'd never told anyone. I've never felt successful, not once. Every achievement feels empty the moment I reach it. Every goal, once accomplished, just reveals another goal I haven't hit yet. The 7-figure income, the title, the corner office. I thought they'd make me feel like I'd finally arrived, like I'd finally proven I was enough. But I just feel hollow, like I'm running on a treadmill that speeds up every time I think I'm catching up. Dr. Chen asked the question that would crack something open. Who are you trying to prove something to? James's carefully controlled expression faltered. What do you mean? All this achievement, all this success. Who is it for? What are you trying to prove, and to whom? The silence stretched for 3 full minutes. James's jaw worked, his hands clenched, his eyes grew wet. Then he said, voice breaking, "I'm still trying to prove to my father that I'm not weak. I'm still trying to make him see that I'm not that crying boy he despised. Even though he's been dead for 12 years, I'm still running from his contempt." This was the performance wound, the compulsive achievement driven not by authentic calling or natural ambition, but by compensation for core shame around masculine adequacy. James didn't work because he loved his work. He worked because stopping would mean facing the void inside, the place where self-worth should live, but instead held only his father's voice, telling him he wasn't enough. Every promotion was an attempt to silence that voice. Every deal closed was evidence that he wasn't weak. Every competitor crushed was proof that he wasn't the contemptible boy crying in his bedroom. The problem: no amount of external achievement can heal an internal wound. The father's contempt had become James's internal voice. He'd internalized the critic so completely that even his objective success couldn't touch the subjective experience of inadequacy. James had been married twice, both marriages ending in bitter divorces that left his children damaged and his ex-wives describing him as emotionally abusive, controlling, and incapable of real intimacy. His first marriage to Michelle began in his late 20s when he was building his career. She was attracted to his ambition and competence. He was attracted to her warmth and emotional openness, qualities he'd completely lost access to but unconsciously sought in women. The first 2 years were good, or so James thought. Michelle would later describe it differently. "It was good when everything was under his control, but the moment I had needs, opinions, or emotions that complicated his plans, he withdrew completely or became cruel." The pattern was clear in retrospect. Whenever Michelle expressed emotional needs, wanted more of his time and presence, or tried to discuss relationship issues, James experienced it as attack and criticism. He'd become cold and distant, work even longer hours, or respond with cutting remarks designed to make her feel foolish for being so needy and emotional. When she cried during arguments, he felt contempt, just like his father felt toward him. When she wanted physical affection beyond sex, he felt suffocated. When she said, "I need you to be emotionally present," he heard, "You're failing as a man." They had 2 children. James insisted on it because successful men have families. But James was largely absent in their lives, working constantly, traveling frequently, present physically but gone emotionally. Michelle begged him to go to couples therapy. He refused, seeing it as admission of failure, evidence of weakness. The marriage lasted 8 years before Michelle filed for divorce, taking the children and half of everything he'd built. James responded by finding another relationship within 6 months, someone younger, less demanding, more impressed by his success. His second marriage followed the exact same pattern: attraction based on his competence and her emotional warmth, growing distance as her needs became apparent, increasing control and criticism to maintain the structure he needed, eventual collapse when she couldn't sustain the relationship on his terms alone. In therapy, Dr. Chen asked James to describe the moment when he knew he should have left his second marriage, but didn't. He said, "She was standing in our bedroom crying, telling me she felt like she was married to a stranger, that I never let her actually know me. And I stood there feeling nothing but irritation and anger that she was making everything so dramatic and complicated. I thought, if you can't handle a man who works hard and provides everything you could need, then you're just too weak and emotional. Now I see it differently. I was terrified of what she was asking for, to actually be known, because if she knew the real me, the weak, wounded, terrified person underneath the performance, she'd have the same contempt my father did." This was the intimacy wound. using distance, control, and emotional lockdown to protect against the vulnerability that early wounding made feel like mortal danger. James couldn't offer emotional intimacy because doing so would require accessing emotions he'd spent decades avoiding. He couldn't let anyone truly know him because the person beneath the mask was the contemptible boy his father rejected. He couldn't meet his partner's needs for emotional presence because he'd amputated that capacity at age 9. His relationships were doomed from the start, not because he chose wrong partners, but because he unconsciously chose women who could never truly reach him, or he destroyed the connection when it threatened to become real. The loneliness he felt, even within marriages, was the inevitable outcome of maintaining protective distance while desperately wanting connection. James's controlled executive exterior concealed volcanic rage that erupted with terrifying intensity. Both ex-wives described his anger as his most frightening quality, not because he was physically violent. He never hit them, though he came close, but because the fury was so disproportionate to triggers and so clearly dangerous. James would explode over minor provocations, traffic delays, technological glitches, service that wasn't immediate, sports teams losing, people not following his instructions precisely. These eruptions left everyone around him walking on eggshells, trying to avoid the next explosion. His children grew up terrified of disappointing him, not because he'd hit them, but because his rage filled the entire house, with tension so thick it was hard to breathe. But James also experienced the opposite, periods of complete emotional flatness where he felt nothing at all, or worse, turned the rage inward as savage self-criticism and darkening depression. The suicide attempt came during one of these inverted rage periods, all that fury redirected at himself, manifesting as the belief that he'd be better off dead, that everyone would be better off without him, that the world didn't need another damaged, broken man pretending to have it together. In therapy, Dr. Chen helped James explore what lived beneath the rage. It took months of careful excavation because James's entire psychological structure was built around never accessing vulnerable emotions. But gradually, using techniques of active imagination and somatic therapy, where his body would reveal what his mind tried to hide, James began to discover the archaeology beneath his anger, beneath the rage at his ex-wife for being so demanding, terror that he was failing, that he wasn't good enough, that he was the weak, inadequate man his father said he was, beneath the rage at his son for not respecting him, grief that he'd repeated his father's patterns, that he'd wounded his own children, that he'd become the very thing he hated, beneath the rage at colleagues who questioned his decisions, shame that he might be wrong, that his competence might be facade, that people might see through the performance, beneath the rage at himself that led to the suicide attempt, overwhelming grief for the life he'd never lived, the authentic self he'd never been, the relationships he'd destroyed, the children he'd traumatized. Dr. Chen said something in one session that James would never forget. "Your rage is a loyal guardian. It's been protecting you from feeling what your father taught you was unacceptable: fear, grief, vulnerability, shame. The problem is that the guardian has grown so large that it's now destroying the very life it was trying to protect." James realized that his anger wasn't pathological. It was the natural response to systematic trauma that had no other outlet. Anger was the only emotion his father had modeled, and the only one that felt masculine enough to express. Every other feeling got compressed into rage or shut down entirely. The fury at traffic wasn't about traffic. It was 40 years of unfelt grief, terror, shame, and powerlessness, erupting through the one emotional valve that remained open. James's workaholism wasn't just about proving his worth, it was also about avoiding interior experience. If he worked 18 hours a day, he didn't have to be alone with his thoughts. If he scheduled every moment, he never had to sit still and feel what lived inside him. Work was the acceptable addiction. Culture celebrates the workaholic, rewards him, gives him status and income and the appearance of admirable dedication. But James also used other numbing behaviors. He drank, not falling down alcoholic quantities, but consistent evening drinking that kept emotions at bay. 3 drinks every night, sometimes 4 or 5 on weekends, always with the justification that successful men enjoy fine scotch, that he deserved to unwind after the day's stress. The drinking started in college and never stopped, becoming so normalized that he didn't recognize it as self-medication. He used pornography compulsively, not as occasional sexual outlet, but as daily escape, sometimes multiple times per day, often choosing it over actual intimacy with his partners. The porn wasn't about sexual desire as much as about disconnection. Fantasy women who made no emotional demands, required no vulnerability, and disappeared with the close of a browser window. He kept his schedule relentlessly full: work, gym, dinners, events, travel, anything to avoid unstructured time where he might have to be present with himself. Even his exercise was compulsive, driven by control and appearance maintenance rather than genuine self-care. In therapy, when Dr. Chen asked James to try sitting in silence for just 15 minutes without distraction, no phone, no work, no TV, no alcohol, nothing, he lasted less than 5 minutes before the anxiety became unbearable. "I feel like I'm going to crawl out of my skin," he said, "like there's something terrible inside me that's going to consume me if I sit still long enough for it to catch up." Dr. Chen nodded. "That's what you've been running from your entire adult life." The wounded 9-year-old boy who watched his father's violence, felt his contempt, learned that emotions were dangerous, and decided the only way to survive was to never feel again. That boy is still inside you, and he's carrying 40 years of unfelt pain. Every addiction, every compulsive behavior, every moment of filling your time, it's all to avoid encountering him. This was the numbing wound, the desperate use of work, substances, behaviors, and constant distraction to avoid the interior reality that feels too dangerous to face. James had spent decades fleeing his own psyche, building an empire of external success. While the internal world remained a terrifying wilderness he dared not enter. Even 12 years after his father's death, James was still unconsciously seeking his approval. In therapy, Dr. Chen helped him see how every major life decision was still oriented toward proving something to the dead patriarch. His career success wasn't about his own fulfillment. It was about finally being good enough in his father's eyes. His contempt for weak men was his father's voice, still judging others the way his father judged him. His driving, authoritarian leadership style was modeled directly on his father's military command approach. Even his choice to have children was driven by his father's values. Successful men have families, continue the family line, produce offspring to carry on the legacy. James realized with horror that he'd been unconsciously performing his entire life for an audience of one man who was dead and who, even when alive, would never give the approval James desperately sought. He'd sacrificed authentic relationships, personal fulfillment, emotional depth, creative expression, joy, all in service of proving to a ghost that he wasn't the contemptible, weak boy crying in his bedroom. Worse, he'd become exactly what his father was. James's own children feared him, walked on eggshells around his moods, experienced his love as conditional on their performance and achievement. His 17-year-old son had stopped speaking to him because James had criticized his career aspirations, wanting to be a teacher rather than pursuing something more ambitious. His daughter flinched when he entered rooms, had developed anxiety and an eating disorder that started around age 13 when James began commenting on her appearance and weight. "I swore I would never be my father," James said, voice breaking. "I swore I would never make my children feel the way he made me feel, and I did exactly that. I wounded them in exactly the ways I was wounded. The entire legacy of pain just passes down, generation after generation, because we're all unconscious of what we're carrying." This was the father hunger wound, the desperate, lifelong search for masculine approval from authority figures, mentors, and bosses, combined with the compulsive replication of father dynamics, even when they were destructive. James had never received the blessing, initiation, and unconditional love a boy needs from his father. He'd spent 5 decades trying to earn it, never recognizing that it couldn't be earned because the wound wasn't about his worthiness. It was about his father's inability to give what James needed. James's sexuality was completely disconnected from emotional intimacy and embodied presence. Sex was performance, another domain where he had to prove his adequacy and control. He experienced erectile dysfunction increasingly as he aged, which terrified him because it threatened his masculine identity. He'd started using Viagra in his late 30s, not because of physical problems, but because the performance anxiety made natural arousal inconsistent. His pornography use had escalated over the years. What started as occasional viewing became daily, then multiple times daily, the material becoming increasingly extreme as regular content lost its intensity. He preferred porn to actual sex because porn required no emotional presence, no vulnerability, no risk of being inadequate or rejected. When he did have partnered sex, he was completely in his head, monitoring his performance, judging his stamina, watching himself from outside rather than actually being present in his body. His partners could sense it. They described sex with James as mechanical, distant, like he was going through motions rather than actually being with them. Dr. Chen helped James see that his sexual disconnection was another manifestation of his core wound. You can't be present in your body during sex because you've been dissociated from your body since childhood, she explained. Your body is where emotions live. Grief in the chest, fear in the belly, rage in the shoulders and jaw. You disconnected from your body to avoid feeling, but sexuality requires embodiment. It requires presence. It requires vulnerability and emotional connection. All the things you've spent your life avoiding. James also carried profound shame around sexuality, absorbed from his mother's religious beliefs and his father's disgust at anything weak or feminine. He could only be fully sexual with women he didn't respect, creating the classic Madonna-whore split. His wives became mothers, not lovers. He lost sexual attraction once they had his children, unconsciously unable to integrate the nurturing maternal feminine with the sexual, passionate feminine. This was the embodiment wound, sexuality disconnected from presence, intimacy, and sacred union, becoming instead another domain of performance, control, and ultimately compulsive escape through fantasy rather than connection. Despite his professional success, 2 marriages, 2 children, numerous colleagues, and a current girlfriend, James was profoundly, devastatingly lonely. He was surrounded by people, but truly known by none of them, because he'd never allowed anyone to see beneath the carefully controlled performance. His friendships were surface level at best, drinking buddies, golf partners, professional contacts. He'd never had the kind of deep male friendship where vulnerability was possible, where he could admit struggle, where emotional support was offered and received. The masculine code didn't allow for that. Male relationships were supposed to be about activity and competition, not emotional intimacy. His romantic relationships were characterized by the terrible paradox of desperate need for connection, combined with complete inability to actually connect. He chose partners hoping they would somehow save him, fill the void. make him feel less alone. Then he made genuine connection impossible through his emotional unavailability and control. Even more devastating, James was unknown to himself. He couldn't identify his actual feelings in most moments. If you asked him, "What are you feeling?" he would answer with thoughts, "I think this situation is frustrating," rather than, "I feel angry." He'd lost access to his interior landscape, his dreams, his longings, his authentic desires beneath the programmed ambitions. He didn't know what brought him joy, because he'd stopped allowing joy decades ago. He didn't know what his soul wanted because he'd never developed interior listening. In one particularly powerful therapy session, Dr. Chen asked James, "If you could set aside all the programming, your father's expectations, culture's demands, your fear of judgment, what would you actually want your life to be?" James couldn't answer. He sat in silence for 10 minutes, then said quietly, "I have no idea. I don't know who I am beyond the performance. I don't know what I want beyond proving I'm not weak. I feel like I'm a stranger to myself." This was the isolation wound. Profound loneliness despite connections. Fundamental unknowability to others and to self. The experience of being trapped inside a persona so rigid that the authentic person beneath had nearly disappeared entirely. James had achieved everything that culture told him would bring meaning and fulfillment. High income, prestigious position, beautiful homes, attractive partners, healthy children, initially, respect from peers, material abundance. Yet sitting in Dr. Chen's office after his suicide attempt, James described his life as completely hollow, like I've been climbing a mountain my entire life, only to get to the top and discover there's nothing there. Just empty air and the realization that I've wasted decades climbing toward nothing that matters. His career meant nothing to him. Tech leadership was his father's unlived dream, not his own calling. He'd chosen it because it offered money, status, and the opportunity to prove his worth through achievement. But he'd never once asked whether this was what his soul wanted to do with its limited time on Earth. His relationships were obligations rather than sources of meaning, duties to fulfill, roles to perform, but not genuine connection that fed something deep in him. His children represented continuation of legacy, not authentic desire to nurture and guide young souls. His possessions were status symbols, not things that brought actual joy. "What makes your soul come alive?" Dr. Chen asked. "When do you feel most authentically yourself?" James thought for a long time. "I used to love teaching," he finally said. "When I was in grad school, before I went corporate, I was a teaching assistant. I loved working with the students who were struggling, the ones who felt stupid or inadequate. I could see their potential, even when they couldn't. Helping them discover their capabilities, watching them grow, that was the only time in my adult life I felt like I was doing something that mattered." "So why didn't you pursue teaching?" "Because my father said it was for people who couldn't make it in the real world. Because teachers don't make real money. Because I needed to prove I was more than that." James realized with devastating clarity that he'd chosen a life designed to prove his worth to others, rather than a life that expressed his actual calling. He'd climbed the wrong mountain, won games he didn't care about, sacrificed authentic meaning for external validation. 47 years into his life, and he'd barely started living from his actual self. This was the meaning wound, the absence of soul calling, purpose, or authentic direction. Life became about fulfilling others' expectations, meeting cultural standards, checking boxes that were supposed to bring fulfillment, but instead created quiet desperation and the haunting sense that you're living someone else's story. Now let's step back and see how these 9 manifestations of James's wounding functioned together as an integrated system that determined his entire life trajectory. This is what Jung meant when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." James's father wound was the foundation, the core injury that shaped everything else. From age 9, he carried the unconscious decision: I must never be vulnerable or weak again. This single wound created ripples that touched every domain of his life. The performance wound was the compensation, the way he tried to heal the father wound through external achievement, never recognizing that no amount of success could touch the interior injury. The intimacy wound was the protection, maintaining distance to ensure he'd never be vulnerable enough to experience contempt and rejection again. The rage wound was the guardian, protecting him from accessing the deeper, more vulnerable emotions that felt too dangerous. The numbing wound was the escape, using work, alcohol, and pornography to avoid the interior reality that was too painful to face. The father hunger kept him oriented toward external authority and approval, never developing his own internal masculine authority. The sexual disconnection prevented the embodied presence and vulnerability that intimate sexuality requires. The isolation wound was the inevitable outcome, surrounded by people but known by none. Because genuine connection requires the very vulnerability his entire psychological structure was designed to prevent. The meaning wound was the ultimate cost, a life spent climbing toward goals that meant nothing to his soul, pursuing someone else's dreams, never asking what his authentic self actually wanted. These weren't separate problems. They were interconnected manifestations of a coherent wound pattern, an architecture of pain built in childhood and operating from complete unconsciousness until James's suicide attempt forced the system to crack open. Jung called this the compulsion to repeat. Wounded men unconsciously recreate their wounding in every relationship and situation until consciousness intervenes. James chose partners who would inevitably want emotional intimacy he couldn't provide, ensuring relationship failure that confirmed his belief that he was unlovable. He parented his children with the same critical, distant, achievement-focused approach his father used, ensuring they would carry the same wounds into their lives. He pursued career success that brought no fulfillment, ensuring perpetual hollowness that confirmed life was meaningless. The wounds created his destiny, not through conscious choice, but through unconscious pattern that ran like code in the background, determining every major decision while he remained completely unaware of what was directing him. James's journey through 2 years of intensive Jungian analysis wasn't linear or easy. There were many moments when he wanted to quit, when the pain of consciousness felt worse than the numbness of denial, when facing his wounds seemed more unbearable than continuing to act them out unconsciously. But something kept him coming back, the recognition that he had nothing left to lose. His suicide attempt had revealed that the old way of being was literally killing him. His relationships were destroyed. His children wouldn't speak to him. His professional success felt like ash. The persona he'd spent 47 years building had collapsed, and beneath it, he'd found a terrified, wounded boy who'd been frozen at age 9, running the man's life from the shadows. The healing work wasn't about fixing James or making him better. It was about integration, reclaiming the emotional, vulnerable, relational capacities that had been amputated, making conscious the wounds that had been unconscious, and learning to live from his authentic self rather than his protective persona. He learned to cry, slowly, painfully, with tremendous resistance at first. Dr. Chen created safe space for the grief he'd been carrying for 40 years to finally surface. He cried for the boy who watched his father's violence and learned emotions were dangerous. He cried for the decades lost to performing rather than being. He cried for the marriages he'd destroyed, the children he'd wounded, the relationships that could have been real if he'd been capable of presence. He learned to feel beneath the rage, discovering the terror, grief, and shame his anger had been protecting. The work was somatic as much as psychological. His body held the wound memory, and healing required letting his body release what his mind had been suppressing. He confronted his father wound directly through active imagination exercises, where he dialogued with his internal father, finally saying everything he'd never been able to say. Your contempt shaped my entire life. Your impossible standards made me believe I could never be enough. Your violence taught me that power means hurting people. Your absence taught me that fathers leave. But I'm done living my life trying to prove something to you. I'm done letting your voice determine my worth. He began the painful work of mourning, grieving the father he needed but never had, the childhood he deserved but didn't receive, the authentic life he could have lived if he hadn't been so wounded. Jung understood that grief is the pathway through masculine wounding. You have to mourn what was lost before you can reclaim what remains. He made amends where possible, writing letters to his children acknowledging how he'd wounded them, not making excuses or defending himself, simply taking responsibility for the pain he'd caused. His son eventually agreed to limited contact and family therapy. His daughter needed more time, but at least she could see her father was finally trying to change. He left his corporate position and began teaching part-time at a community college, working with students who struggled academically and believed they were inadequate. He created a program for young men from difficult backgrounds, offering the mentoring, guidance, and unconditional support he'd never received. His wounded healer archetype emerged. His pain became his medicine. His wounding became his calling. He developed genuine male friendships for the first time in his adult life, joining a men's group where vulnerability was practiced and masks could drop, discovering what it meant to be truly known by other men without judgment or competition. He learned that strength isn't the absence of vulnerability, it's the capacity to be vulnerable and remain present. That masculinity isn't emotional numbness, it's emotional fluidity integrated with groundedness. That success isn't proving worth, it's expressing authentic calling. James's transformation demonstrated what Jung promised. When wounds become conscious, they lose their power to determine your destiny. The patterns can be seen, interrupted, and changed. The unconscious compulsion can be brought into awareness, where choice becomes possible. James didn't become a different person. He became who he actually was beneath the protective armor, still strong but with strength that included rather than excluded vulnerability, still ambitious but with ambition directed toward authentic calling rather than compensation for inadequacy, still masculine but with masculinity that was whole rather than amputated. Now I need you to consider something. How much of James's story do you recognize in yourself? Not the specific details, but the underlying patterns, the performance, the distance, the rage beneath the surface, the numbing, the loneliness, the hollowness, because James isn't unique. His story is the story of masculine wounding, playing out in millions of men's lives, creating unconscious destinies that look like choice, but are actually compulsion. The 9 signs I'm about to reveal systematically aren't abstractions or theoretical constructs. They're the visible manifestations of invisible wounds, the ways your childhood pain is showing up in your adult life, determining your relationships, your career, your emotional reality, your very sense of self. Are you ready to see them? Are you willing to recognize how your own wounds might be creating your destiny? Can you handle the truth about the invisible architecture that's been running your life from the shadows? Let's discover what these 9 spiritual signs reveal about the wounds you carry. The first spiritual sign that reveals you're carrying silent wounds, emotional numbness or severe restriction, where you can access only a narrow range of feelings, while the full spectrum of human emotion remains foreign territory. Most men experience this as normal. You probably don't think of yourself as emotionally numb. You just think you're not overly emotional like some people. You're controlled, rational, grounded. You don't get swept away by feelings. You're the calm one in crisis, the steady presence when others are falling apart, the rock that doesn't crack under pressure. Culture tells you this is masculine strength. You've been praised for it your entire life. He's so level-headed. He doesn't let emotions cloud his judgment. He keeps it together when things get tough. It looks like emotional maturity, psychological strength, admirable stoicism. But Jung would ask you a different question. Can you actually feel, or have you just become very good at not feeling? Let me show you what emotional numbness actually looks like, because it's often invisible to the person experiencing it. Can you cry? Not just rare tears at funerals or during extreme grief, but actually access tears when you're moved, touched, overwhelmed, or heartbroken. When was the last time you cried? If the answer is, I can't remember, or years ago, you're not emotionally strong, you're emotionally restricted. Can you identify what you're feeling beyond fine, stressed, or annoyed? If someone asks, how are you feeling about your father's health crisis? Can you name the specific emotions, fear of loss, grief, helplessness, love, regret, anger? Or do you default to, I don't know, it's tough, while intellectualizing the situation? Do you experience physical symptoms that doctors can't explain? Headaches, digestive issues, back pain, chest tightness, muscle tension, especially during emotionally charged periods. Your body is expressing what your psyche won't allow into consciousness. Is anger the only strong emotion you can reliably access? When something bothers you, hurts you, disappoints you, or breaks your heart, and does it all get filtered through irritation or rage, because that's the only emotional valve that remains open? Do you describe emotional experiences in cognitive terms rather than feeling terms? I think I was sad rather than I felt devastated. It seems like it would be upsetting rather than I'm actually upset. This is dissociation. You're observing emotions intellectually rather than experiencing them directly. When your partner, friend, or family member is emotional, do you feel uncomfortable, impatient, or slightly contemptuous? Do you want them to calm down or stop being so dramatic? That discomfort isn't about their emotion. It's about your inability to access yours, which makes their emotional fluidity feel threatening. Jung called this affect isolation, the psychological defense mechanism where you split off from feeling to survive an environment where emotions were dangerous, shamed, or punished. It's not temperament, it's trauma response. Here's what actually happened. Somewhere in your development, probably very early, you learned that emotional expression brought pain. Maybe your father's message was explicit. Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Maybe it was subtle. The withdrawal of affection when you showed vulnerability. The embarrassment in his face when you were afraid. The praise that only came when you toughened up. Maybe your mother's needs were so overwhelming that you had to shut down your own emotions to take care of hers. Maybe you were bullied and learned that showing any vulnerable emotion invited attack. Maybe you experienced trauma, abuse, loss, violence, and the emotions were so overwhelming that the only way to survive was to stop feeling entirely. Whatever the origin, you made an unconscious decision. Emotions are dangerous. Vulnerability invites pain, and safety means maintaining rigid control over your interior experience. So you systematically shut down emotional access. Not consciously, this happened below awareness as an automatic protective response. The problem, you can't selectively numb emotion. When you shut down the negative feelings, grief, fear, vulnerability, shame, you also shut down the positive ones, joy, love, awe, tenderness, delight. You end up living in a narrow band of mild contentment, interrupted by occasional anger, missing the full spectrum of human experience. Jung understood that this creates multiple catastrophic consequences. Genuine intimacy requires emotional presence and vulnerability. If you can't access your own feelings, you can't be emotionally present with another person. You can't meet them in their joy or their suffering. You can't create the emotional attunement that deep relationships require. Your partners experience you as distant, unavailable, like they're in relationship with a wall. They tell you they need more from you emotionally, and you have no idea what they're talking about because from your perspective, you're there, you provide, you're committed. What more could they want? What they want is the person behind the performance. They want access to your interior world, your fears, your dreams, your vulnerabilities, your authentic self. But that interior world has been locked down for so long that even you can't access it anymore. Emotions don't disappear when you suppress them. They go into the unconscious and become shadow material, growing darker, more powerful, and more dangerous in the darkness. Eventually, they erupt in ways you can't control. The man who never shows emotion suddenly explodes in rage that destroys his career or his marriage. The stoic who prides himself on control has a breakdown that comes out of nowhere. The rock discovers that beneath his emotional numbness is catastrophic depression or suicidal ideation that he never saw coming. Jung wrote, "Everything that we fail to integrate consciously emerges later as fate. Your unfelt emotions will eventually force themselves into consciousness, usually in the most destructive ways possible at the most inconvenient times. Men who can't access emotions directly often develop compulsive behaviors to create feeling. Alcohol releases the emotions that sobriety keeps locked down. Pornography creates intensity in an otherwise numb interior. Workaholism provides the acceptable high of achievement-driven adrenaline. Risk-taking behaviors offer the rush that breaks through the emotional flatline. You're not weak or lacking willpower. You're unconsciously trying to make yourself feel something, anything, because emotional numbness is a kind of death. Jung believed that emotions are the language of the soul. Your psyche communicates through feeling, dreams, intuitions, creative impulses, moments of being moved. When you shut down emotional access, you lose connection to the deepest parts of yourself. You become a stranger to your own soul. You can't hear what it's trying to tell you. You can't access the guidance, the meaning, the purpose that emerges from interior listening. You end up living a life that looks successful externally but feels hollow internally because you've lost access to the part of you that knows what authentic living means. Let me give you a detailed example of what the stoic wound looks like in a real life. Michael was 42, a firefighter, married with 3 kids. He came to therapy because his wife gave him an ultimatum: get help or I'm done. You're here physically, but you might as well be dead emotionally. The kids are growing up thinking fathers don't have feelings, and I'm exhausted being in relationship with someone who gives me nothing emotionally. Michael was genuinely confused. I provide everything, he told the therapist. I work dangerous shifts to keep the family secure. I coach my son's football team. I fix things around the house. I'm faithful. I don't drink too much. What more does she want? The therapist asked. When was the last time you cried? Michael thought for a long time. My father's funeral, 8 years ago. And before that? I honestly can't remember. Probably when I was a kid. Can you describe what you're feeling right now? I don't know. Fine, I guess. Maybe a little annoyed that I have to be here. The therapist pushed gently. Your wife says she's considering leaving. You might lose your family. What are you feeling about that? Michael's jaw tightened. I think it's unfair. I do everything right, and it's not enough. That's what you think. What do you feel? Long silence. Then, I don't know how to answer that question. This was the stoic wound in a full manifestation. Michael wasn't withholding emotion strategically. He genuinely couldn't access it. 40 years of firefighting culture, masculine conditioning, and childhood messages that emotions were weakness had created complete disconnection from his interior emotional landscape. Over months of therapy, Michael slowly began mapping the territory of his own feelings. It was like learning a foreign language. He'd say things like, "I guess I might be a little sad about that," while his eyes filled with tears he wouldn't let fall. The therapist would point out, "Michael, you're crying right now. That's more than a little sad." Michael discovered that beneath his emotional numbness was terror. Fear that if he started feeling, he wouldn't be able to stop, that he'd fall apart completely, that he'd become the weak, emotional mess his father had taught him to despise. The numbness wasn't protection from external threat. It was protection from interior experience that felt more dangerous than any fire he'd ever fought. Slowly, painfully, Michael learned to cry, first in the therapist's office, then eventually at home. The first time his son saw him cry, when they were watching a movie together and Michael was moved by a scene about father-son reconciliation, his son looked shocked, then moved closer on the couch. Later, his wife said, "That's the first time in 15 years of marriage I've seen you actually present. That's what I've been asking for." Michael realized that his emotional numbness wasn't making him strong. It was making him absent. He was there physically but gone emotionally, and his children were learning that fathers are present but absent ghosts, reliable providers but emotionally void. Now I need you to face something. Emotional numbness isn't natural masculine temperament. It's a wound response. Yes, there are biological differences in emotional processing between men and women. Yes, testosterone affects emotional expression. But the difference between healthy masculine emotional presence and pathological emotional numbness is vast. Healthy masculine emotional processing means you can access the full range of emotions. You can identify what you're feeling. You can express emotion appropriately to context. You can be emotionally present with others. And you can also ground yourself. Remain steady in crisis and not be overwhelmed by feeling. Pathological emotional numbness means you've lost access to most of your emotional range. You can't identify what you're feeling beyond a few basic states. You can't be emotionally present even when you desperately want to, and your groundedness is actually dissociation. The men I've worked with who have the stoic wound almost universally report the same thing once they start healing. I thought I was fine, that I was just naturally not emotional. I didn't realize I was dead inside until I started coming back to life. If you suspect you carry the stoic wound, here's a practice. To begin mapping your emotional landscape. This isn't therapy replacement. It's a starting point for becoming aware of what you've been unconscious of. Get a list of emotions beyond the basics. There are emotional wheels online. Search emotion wheel and find one with concentric circles showing increasingly specific emotions. Spend time each day identifying what you're actually feeling using specific emotional language. Instead of fine, stressed, or annoyed, find the precise words. Am I disappointed, overwhelmed, anxious, resentful, excited, content, moved, vulnerable? Most men with the stoic wound discover they don't have language for nuanced emotional states. You've been using 5 words, fine, tired, stressed, annoyed, good, to describe thousands of possible emotional experiences. Start building vocabulary. Emotions live in the body. When you can't identify feelings cognitively, your body knows. Several times daily, stop and scan your physical experience. Is your chest tight or open? Is your belly relaxed or clenched? Are your shoulders tense? Is your jaw tight? Do you have a headache, backache, or digestive discomfort? These physical sensations are unfelt emotions manifesting somatically. Learn to translate body language. Tight chest often means unexpressed grief or anxiety. Clenched belly is frequently fear or vulnerability. Tense shoulders carry responsibility or unexpressed anger. Tight jaw is suppressed words or emotions. Notice what makes you uncomfortable, impatient, or irritated in others. When does someone's emotional expression bother you? When do you want people to calm down or stop being dramatic? Your discomfort reveals your wound. The emotions that trigger you in others are usually the emotions you've forbidden in yourself. If someone crying makes you uncomfortable, it's probably because your own grief is locked away. If vulnerability in others makes you contemptuous, it's because your own vulnerability was shamed. This one is difficult but essential. Deliberately engage material designed to access emotion, movies, music, poetry, art, and notice your response. Do you feel moved? Can you let yourself cry? If you haven't cried in months or years, you're probably not experiencing an absence of things to cry about. You're experiencing dissociation from grief, loss, beauty, and tender emotion. Practice letting tears come without judgment. Crying isn't weakness, it's emotional literacy. Ask people close to you, do you experience me as emotionally present and available? Listen to what they say without defending or explaining. If multiple people describe you as distant, unavailable, or emotionally shut down, believe them. They can see from the outside what you can't see from inside. Consider working with a somatic therapist, doing breath work, or engaging physical practices that help release stored emotions. Your wounds are held in your body, not just your mind. Talk therapy alone won't always reach the unfelt feelings that live in your tissues. Before we move forward, I need to warn you about how the Stoic wound knowledge can be misused. Don't weaponize this insight to excuse harmful behavior. I can't be emotionally available because I have the Stoic wound. That's not healing. That's using psychological language to avoid responsibility. The work is to heal the numbness, not to use it as justification for continuing to harm relationships through emotional absence. Some men, upon recognizing their emotional restriction, try to force emotions they don't actually feel. They manufacture tears, perform vulnerability, create dramatic emotional displays because they think that's what healing looks like. Jung would warn, this is just another mask, another persona. You're trading the stoic man performance for the emotionally available man performance. Neither is authentic. Real healing means gradually, genuinely reconnecting to what you actually feel, not performing what you think you should feel. When you start accessing emotions, you might feel shame or contempt for the years you spent numb. I wasted decades being emotionally dead. I'm disgusted with who I was. This is the wound turning against itself. You weren't weak or broken. You were wounded and doing your best to survive with the tools you had. Have compassion for the man who numbed himself to survive. He did what he had to do. Now you're doing something different because you can. Some men swing from complete numbness to complete emotional flooding, crying uncontrollably, exploding in rage, becoming overwhelmed by every feeling. This isn't health. This is the pendulum swinging from one extreme to another. Healthy emotional processing means you can feel without being overwhelmed. You can express without being excessive. You can be present with emotion without being controlled by it. The goal isn't to become emotional. It's to become emotionally literate and present. Here's what Jung understood that most people miss. The Stoic wound isn't about feeling too little. It's about having been forced to abandon your emotional body to survive. You weren't born numb. Watch any young boy before the world gets to him. He feels deeply, expressively, without shame. The numbness came later, as adaptation to an environment that punished emotional expression. The healing isn't about becoming more emotional. It's about reclaiming access to the full range of human experience That's your birthright. It's about no longer needing to protect yourself from your own interior reality. It's about being able to cry when life breaks your heart, laugh when joy fills you, express fear when you're terrified, and be tender when you're moved, without experiencing any of these as threats to your masculine identity. Jung wrote, "Sentimentality is a superstructure covering brutality." He meant this: men who can't access genuine emotion often alternate between false sentimentality, manufactured feeling that's socially acceptable, and brutality, the violence that erupts when unfelt emotions explode from the unconscious. The path forward requires courage, not the courage to storm beaches or fight enemies, but the courage to feel what you've been avoiding, to cry the tears you've been suppressing, to be vulnerable with people who matter, to admit that you're not fine and haven't been for years. Michael, the firefighter, said something in therapy that I'll never forget. "I spent 20 years running into burning buildings without hesitation, but I was terrified to feel my own feelings. Turns out that facing your interior reality requires more courage than any physical danger I've ever encountered." He was right. The stoic wound can only be healed by doing what masculine conditioning absolutely forbids: descending into your emotional depths, feeling what you've been fleeing, and emerging with the full range of your humanity intact. If you recognized yourself in this sign, know this: your emotional numbness isn't your fault. You didn't choose it consciously. It was adaptation to circumstances that made feeling dangerous. But now, as an adult with more resources and safety, you can choose differently. You can choose to feel. You can choose to reclaim your emotional body. You can choose to be present rather than absent, alive rather than numb, connected rather than isolated. The question is, are you willing? The second spiritual sign that reveals silent wounds: a relentless, never-satisfied drive to achieve, accumulate, and prove your worth through external accomplishments, where you're perpetually striving but never arriving, always chasing the next goal that you believe will finally make you feel enough. Look at your life honestly. How many hours do you work? Not because the work demands it, but because stopping feels unbearable. How much of your identity is wrapped up in your title, your income, your achievements, your status? When someone asks, "Who are you?" do you immediately respond with what you do? "I'm a lawyer. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a VP of marketing." As if your work is your identity rather than something you do. When you accomplish something significant, close a deal, get promoted, hit a financial milestone, win recognition, how long does the satisfaction last before it evaporates and you're already focused on the next goal? Hours, days. Does it ever feel like enough? Do you measure your worth by external metrics? Bank account, square footage of your home, prestige of your title, impressiveness of your car, success of your children? Are you constantly comparing yourself to other men, feeling inferior when they're ahead, or secretly satisfied when they're behind? Can you rest without feeling guilty? Can you take vacation without checking email? Spend a Saturday doing nothing productive? Sit still for a few hours without the nagging sense that you should be working on something? What happens when you're not achieving? When work slows down? When you retire? When you face a career setback? Does depression creep in? Does your sense of self start to crumble? Do you feel lost, purposeless, like you don't know who you are without the external validation that achievement provides? If you answered yes to most of these questions, you're carrying what Jung recognized as one of the most destructive masculine wounds: the compulsive need to prove worth through performance because you never developed a sense of inherent value. This isn't ambition. This isn't healthy drive or natural competitiveness. This is compensation for a core wound around masculine adequacy: the internalized belief that you are not enough simply because you exist, that your value must be earned through continuous achievement. that rest equals worthlessness, that your right to take up space on this planet depends on what you produce and accomplish. Jung called this inflation of the persona, complete identification with your social role and achievements, while your actual self remains underdeveloped, hidden or forgotten entirely. You become what you do, and since what you do is never quite enough, you never get to simply be. This wound almost always originates in childhood relationship with fathers who offered conditional love based on achievement. The message was direct or indirect, spoken or silent, but devastatingly clear. I will approve of you, love you, be proud of you, if you perform, achieve, and meet my standards. The father's love felt like something you had to earn rather than something freely given. Maybe he lit up with pride when you won, but withdrew into disappointment when you fell short. Maybe he praised your A, but criticized the A-. Maybe he compared you to siblings, cousins, or his idealized vision of who you should be. Maybe his approval came only after significant achievement, never for simply being his son. Or maybe the father was absent, physically or emotionally, and you learned that becoming successful, accomplished, and impressive might finally make him notice you, return, or regret his absence. The unconscious logic: if I achieve enough, maybe he'll see me. Maybe he'll come back. Maybe he'll finally be proud. For some men, the performance wound comes from mothers who pushed achievement as protection. You need to be successful so you'll be safe in this dangerous world. The message beneath: you're not enough as you are. You need to become more to be acceptable and secure. For others, it comes from economic instability, growing up poor and internalizing the message that worth equals earning power, that you'll only escape poverty and prove you're different from your struggling parents by achieving material success. For still others, it comes from masculine culture itself, the relentless message that a man's value is measured by his income, his title, his possessions, his ability to provide. That real men are successful, that failure equals emasculation, that your worth to others is determined by what you can offer them materially. Whatever the specific origin, the wound creates the same unconscious core belief. I am not inherently valuable. I must earn my right to exist through continuous achievement. My worth is determined by external measures of success. If I stop performing, I become worthless. This belief operates completely outside conscious awareness. You don't think to yourself, I believe I'm worthless unless I achieve. But your behavior reveals the belief. The compulsive work, the inability to rest, the constant striving, the measurement of self against others, the hollow feeling after each accomplishment, the depression when achievement slows. Once this wound is in place, it determines your entire life trajectory. Let me show you how. You choose careers based on external validation rather than authentic interest or soul calling. What matters isn't whether the work is meaningful to you. It's whether it pays well, carries prestige, impresses others, or proves you're successful. You might be naturally drawn to teaching, art, social work, or craftsmanship, but these don't offer enough status or income to satisfy the wound. So you go into law, finance, tech, or corporate leadership, spending decades in work that feels hollow but looks impressive. The tragedy: you sacrifice your actual calling, the work your soul wants to do, for work that might finally make you feel worthy. But the wound is unfillable through external success, so you remain both successful and unfulfilled. Your relationships become secondary to achievement. Partners complain you're never present, always working, unavailable emotionally because you're consumed by career. Children grow up barely knowing you because you're constantly at the office, or mentally preoccupied with work when you're physically home. You tell yourself this is noble. You're working so hard for your family, to provide for them, to give them security. But the deeper truth You're working to fill a void inside yourself, and your family is paying the price for your wounding. When your marriage falls apart or your children become distant, you're genuinely confused. You gave them everything materially. How could they be ungrateful? You don't see that what they needed wasn't more money or bigger houses. They needed you, present, available, emotionally engaged. But you were too busy trying to prove your worth to actually show up. Every goal, once achieved, immediately loses meaning. You thought making 6 figures would make you feel successful. Then you hit it and immediately focused on 7 figures. You thought VP would be enough. Then you needed C-suite. You thought that house would satisfy. Then you needed a bigger one. The goalposts keep moving because external achievement can never fill an internal wound. You're trying to solve an interior problem, feeling unworthy, through exterior solutions, accomplishments. It's like trying to quench thirst by eating. No amount of food satisfies because it's the wrong remedy for the actual need. Jung understood this as the fundamental error of the inflated persona, believing that who you appear to be can ever satisfy what you actually are. Your persona, the successful executive, the wealthy entrepreneur, the accomplished professional, can win admiration, status, and money. But yourself, the actual you beneath the performance, remains starving for what it actually needs, to be valued simply for existing, not for what you produce. Some men with the performance wound engage in unconscious self-sabotage right as they approach major success. They have affairs right before major promotions, make terrible business decisions at the edge of breakthrough, develop health crises or addiction relapses right when everything's coming together. Why? Because deep down, the wounded boy doesn't believe he deserves success. Or because actual success means you run out of excuses. If you achieve everything and still feel empty, you have to face that the problem isn't external circumstances, but internal wounding. Staying in pursuit is safer than arriving at the destination and discovering it's hollow. Men with performance wounds often develop contempt for people who aren't driven to achieve. Lazy people, unmotivated people, people who prioritize balance or meaning over money and status. This contempt is projection. You're attacking in others the part of yourself you had to exile, the part that wants rest, that values being overdoing, that doesn't need to prove anything. You might also have complicated relationships with successful people, either desperately seeking their approval, still looking for father's blessing, or competing with them viciously. Can't let anyone be more successful because that threatens your precarious sense of worth. When the achievement machine stops, through retirement, illness, economic downturn, or simply aging, identity crisis erupts. If you are what you do, who are you when you can't do it anymore? Many men experience severe depression, purposelessness, even suicidal ideation when forced to stop achieving. The wound is finally exposed. Without the performance to hide behind, you face the devastating question: who am I really beneath all the accomplishments? Let me show you what this looks like in real life through Marcus's story. Marcus was 51, founder and CEO of a successful consulting firm, recently sold to a larger company for significant money. He came to therapy because, as he put it, I finally got everything I spent my entire adult life working toward, and I feel nothing. Actually, worse than nothing, I feel dead inside. Marcus grew up poor, the son of a factory worker who barely made ends meet. His father wasn't abusive, but he was defeated, a man who'd given up on dreams, settled for survival, and carried obvious shame about his inability to provide more for his family. Marcus's mother constantly worried about money, and he internalized the message. Poverty is shameful. Worth equals earning power. Success means never ending up like his father. By age 15, Marcus had made himself a promise: I will never be poor. I will never be like my father. I will achieve enough that no one can ever look at me the way people looked at him, with pity and contempt. This wound drove everything. Marcus worked 3 jobs through college, graduated top of his class, joined a consulting firm where he outworked everyone else, started his own company at 30, grew it relentlessly through 16-hour days and obsessive focus. He married Sarah because she fit the profile of what successful men had: attractive, educated, supportive, not because of genuine connection or compatibility. His 3 children barely knew him. He worked through dinners, missed recitals and games, was physically present but mentally absent even on vacations because he was always strategizing about the next business move. Sarah complained constantly that he was married to his work, not to her. His daughter once said at age 12, "I wish you loved us as much as you love your company." Marcus heard these complaints but couldn't really absorb them. His internal logic: I'm providing everything: big house, private schools, luxury vacations, financial security. What more do they want? Do they not understand I'm doing this for them? The truth he couldn't see: he was doing it for the wounded boy inside who was terrified of poverty and convinced that worth equals achievement. His family was collateral damage in his war against internal unworthiness. Then came the sale, the exit he'd been building toward for 20 years. Suddenly, Marcus had more money than his family could spend in 3 lifetimes, freedom from the daily operations, and time to finally rest. And he fell apart completely. Within 3 months, Marcus was in severe depression. He didn't know what to do with himself. He tried hobbies, golf, travel, investing, but they felt empty. He had no genuine friendships because he'd sacrificed relationships for work. His marriage was hollow. He and Sarah had been roommates for years, their connection sustained only by the busyness that prevented intimacy. His kids were polite but distant. They had their own lives and had long ago stopped expecting much from him emotionally. Marcus described it to his therapist: "For 30 years, I had a clear mission: build success, achieve financial security, prove I wasn't like my father. Now I've done it. And I realized I don't know who I am beyond that mission. I've spent my entire adult life becoming someone who looks successful from the outside, but is completely empty on the inside. I achieved everything and won nothing that actually matters." This is the performance wound at its most devastating: spending decades climbing a mountain only to discover at the summit that you climbed the wrong mountain, that the view from the top is empty, that the person you became in the climb isn't who you wanted to be, and that the life you built in pursuit of external validation cost you everything that would have made life actually meaningful. If you suspect you carry the performance wound, here are questions to help you see the pattern clearly. Close your eyes and imagine achieving something significant. Whose face appears in your mind? Whose approval do you imagine finally receiving? Your father's, your mother's, a mentor's, culture's, God's. The performance wound is almost always about an audience, someone you're still trying to prove something to, even if they're dead or permanently unable to give you what you need. Imagine taking 6 months off work completely. No projects, no goals, no productivity, just being. What feelings arise? Anxiety, terror, guilt, worthlessness. Those feelings reveal the wound. You can't rest because rest means facing the void where self-worth should be. Strip away your title, your income, your possessions, your professional reputation. Who are you underneath all of that? If you can't answer, or if the answer terrifies you, you've confused your persona with yourself. Make an honest inventory. What relationships did you neglect? What health problems did you ignore? What creative interests did you abandon? What parts of yourself did you suppress because they didn't serve ambition? What experiences did you miss because you were always working? The performance wound always extracts a price, usually one you don't fully recognize until it's too late. Pay attention to what success actually feels like. Is it genuine joy and satisfaction, or is it just temporary relief from the anxiety of not being enough, quickly followed by focus on the next goal? If achievement feels more like avoiding punishment than experiencing reward, you're not ambitious, you're wounded. Imagine you were born with inherent, unshakable worth that nothing could diminish. You didn't have to earn it, prove it, or maintain it. What would you do with your life? What career would you choose? How would you spend your time? The distance between that answer and your current life reveals how much the wound is determining your choices. Healing this wound is both simple and devastating. You have to learn that you're enough simply because you exist, not because of what you accomplish. But accepting this feels like death to the ego that's been built entirely around achievement. Here's what the path looks like. You must practice being rather than doing. Set aside time. Start with 1 day per week, eventually more, where you accomplish nothing. No work, no productive hobbies, no exercise that's achievement-oriented, no goals. Just being. The anxiety this creates will be intense. Sit with it. That anxiety is the wound revealing itself. The terror that if you're not achieving, you're worthless. The healing comes from experiencing that you can exist without producing and the world doesn't end. Make amends to the people you've neglected in pursuit of achievement. Have honest conversations with your partner, your children, your friends. Acknowledge that you sacrificed connection for success. Ask what they need from you. This requires ego death, admitting you got it wrong, that success without relationship is hollow, that you need help learning how to prioritize differently. Most men with performance wounds would rather die than admit this kind of failure. Practice introducing yourself without your title or achievements. I'm Marcus instead of I'm Marcus, CEO of. Notice the discomfort. That discomfort reveals your identification with persona rather than self. Develop answers to who are you that have nothing to do with what you do. I'm someone learning to be present. I'm a man confronting his wounds. I'm a father trying to repair relationships with his children. This is the hardest. You must do the interior work of developing inherent sense of worth. This often requires therapy, particularly depth psychology that addresses core beliefs about self. You need to excavate and challenge the programming. I'm only valuable if I achieve. Replace it with truth. I'm valuable because I exist. My worth isn't earned. It's inherent. I deserve to take up space on this planet simply because I'm here. This sounds simple. It's actually the most difficult psychological work most men with performance wounds will ever do because it requires dismantling the entire identity structure you've spent decades building. Once you've done some healing, you can begin reorienting your life from achievement to meaning. What work actually matters to you? What would you do if money and status weren't factors? What calls to your soul rather than your wound? Marcus, after 2 years of intensive therapy, left consulting entirely and started teaching business skills to entrepreneurs from low-income backgrounds, work that paid almost nothing compared to his previous career but brought genuine fulfillment. He was finally using his skills for something his soul actually cared about rather than for proving his worth. Develop new metrics for a life well lived, quality of relationships, presence with loved ones, moments of genuine joy, creative expression, service to others, interior peace, personal growth, authentic self-expression. Stop measuring by money, title, possessions, status. Those aren't actually measures of a good life. They're measures of a successful persona. And you've learned the hard way. Successful persona doesn't equal fulfilled self. Jung wrote something devastating about men with performance wounds. You are what you do, not what you say you'll do. He meant this. Your life reveals your actual values and priorities. If you say you value family but work 80 hours weekly, your behavior reveals that achievement matters more than relationships, regardless of what you tell yourself. The performance wound creates what Jung called the lie of the persona, the gap between who you appear to be, successful, together, accomplished, and who you actually are, wounded, empty, desperately seeking worth you don't feel. The healing requires brutal honesty about this gap. You have to face that you've been living a lie, not because you're a bad person, but because you confused the performance for the reality. You became the mask and forgot the face beneath. Marcus said something in therapy that captures this. I spent 30 years building a version of myself that other people would admire, and I completely lost track of who I actually was underneath it all. Now I'm 51 years old and I don't know my own face. I can tell you everything about the successful CEO I performed as, but I have no idea who Marcus actually is beyond that role. This recognition, painful as it is the beginning of liberation, because once you see that the performance has been running your life, once you recognize the wound beneath the achievement, once you acknowledge that external success will never fill the internal void, you can finally start choosing differently. You can finally start building a life based on what actually matters to your soul, rather than what might prove your worth to ghosts from childhood. You can finally rest. You can finally be enough simply because you exist. Is this easy? No. Most men with performance wounds never do this work. They die still proving, still achieving, still empty, despite the impressive obituary that lists all their accomplishments. But some men, the ones who have the courage to confront their wounds, discover something revolutionary, that the most important achievement isn't external success. It's internal wholeness. It's becoming who you actually are rather than who you thought you needed to be. Marcus ended therapy with this reflection. I achieved everything and it meant nothing. Now I'm learning to mean something without needing to achieve. It's the hardest and most important work of my life. That's the path through the performance wound. From compulsive proving to authentic being, from persona to self, from the exhausting performance to the revolutionary rest of knowing you're enough exactly as you are. The third spiritual sign that reveals silent wounds, consistent relationship patterns where you maintain emotional distance, exercise control, or unconsciously sabotage intimacy whenever it threatens to become too deep, vulnerable, or exposing. Look carefully at your relationship history. Do you see patterns? Do you choose partners who are emotionally unavailable, ensuring you never have to risk real intimacy? The woman who's married to her career, the one who's not ready for anything serious, the one who's still hung up on her ex. You tell yourself you're unlucky in love, but unconsciously, you're choosing people who can't actually reach you. Or do you choose partners who want deep connection, then systematically withdraw when they get too close? They start wanting more emotional presence, more vulnerability, more of your interior world, and you respond by working longer hours, picking fights, becoming critical, or simply checking out emotionally while remaining physically present. Do your relationships follow a predictable timeline? Great at first when everything's surface level and fun. Deteriorating once it gets serious and she starts having needs, expectations, or desires for emotional intimacy you can't meet. Do you use anger to control distance? When your partner wants to talk about feelings or relationship issues, do you become irritated, dismissive, or rageful, training her to stop asking for what she needs because the emotional cost is too high? Do you have affairs or keep one foot out the door, even in committed relationships? Maintaining secret dating profiles, staying emotionally involved with exes, or having backup options that ensure you never have to fully surrender to intimacy with one person? Do you confuse sex with intimacy, You can be physical, even passionate, but actual emotional nakedness, being truly seen and known, feels terrifying and impossible. Can you be vulnerable? Can you cry in front of your partner, admit when you're afraid or hurt? Share your actual interior experience, including the parts that feel weak or inadequate? Or do you maintain the performance even in your most intimate relationship, never letting your guard down completely? If these patterns are familiar, you're carrying what Jung recognized as the intimacy wound, terror of genuine emotional connection masked as preference for independence, strength, or not needing anyone. This wound has multiple possible origin points, often overlapping. Mother enmeshment. The mother used her son for emotional fulfillment that should have come from adult relationships. She made him her confidant, her emotional support, sometimes her psychological substitute for an absent or inadequate husband. She violated boundaries, physically, emotionally, psychologically, creating a relationship that felt suffocating rather than nurturing. The boy learned, intimate connection with women means losing yourself, being consumed, having no boundaries respected, carrying responsibility for their emotional well-being. As an adult, he unconsciously maintains distance to avoid being engulfed again. Mother abandonment, the opposite wound. Mother who was emotionally unavailable, physically absent, or rejecting. The boy never received consistent love, attunement, or emotional responsiveness. He learned that reaching for connection brings pain, that vulnerability is met with absence or rejection, that he has to be entirely self-sufficient because no one will be there for him. As an adult, he can't risk depending on anyone. Intimacy means needing someone, and needing means inevitable abandonment and devastation. Better to stay distant, maintain control, never need anyone deeply enough to be destroyed when they leave. Father modeling. The boy watched his father maintain emotional distance from his mother, witnessed a marriage devoid of genuine intimacy, absorbed the template that masculine men don't do emotional connection, they provide materially and remain psychologically separate. Or the boy witnessed his father's emotional vulnerability punished, saw his mother mock, belittle, or withdraw from his father when he showed weakness or need. The lesson: showing vulnerability to women is dangerous. They'll use it against you or lose respect for you. Early relational trauma, sexual abuse, attachment disruption, childhood experiences where vulnerability led directly to harm. The boy learned at a primal level that opening yourself emotionally or physically to another person invites violation, pain, or betrayal. As an adult, his entire system is wired to prevent intimacy, because intimacy equals danger. Every cell in his body screams warnings when connection deepens. Get out, withdraw, control the situation, don't let her get too close. Masculine conditioning. Even without specific family trauma, cultural programming teaches boys that needing anyone is weakness, that emotional intimacy is feminine and therefore contemptible, that real men are self-sufficient islands who don't require emotional support or connection. He absorbs the message that masculine identity depends on independence, that admitting you need your partner emotionally is emasculating, that the strong man is the one who needs no one. Once this wound is in place, it determines your entire relational life. You might achieve great success professionally, but your intimate relationships follow predictable patterns of distance, control, and sabotage. Let me show you the specific destiny patterns. You're attracted to unavailable people, the ones who don't want commitment, who keep you at arm's length, who are ambiguous about their feelings. You experience this as chemistry or challenge, not recognizing it's actually comfort. You can pursue endlessly without ever having to risk actual intimacy. When someone is emotionally available and wants genuine connection, you feel no attraction. You experience them as boring, too needy, or not exciting. The truth, they're available, which is terrifying to your wound. You might cycle through relationships, always pursuing the next unavailable person, always experiencing heartbreak, never recognizing that you're unconsciously choosing people who ensure intimacy remains impossible. You enter relationships and initially show up, present, engaged, affectionate. But once your partner develops real feelings, needs, or expectations of emotional intimacy, you begin withdrawing. You work longer hours, you become more irritable and critical. You pick fights over small things. You stop initiating physical affection. You become sexually disconnected. You spend more time with hobbies, friends, or alone. You're still physically in the relationship, but emotionally, you're gone, maintaining just enough presence to keep it from completely ending, but not enough to actually be intimate. Your partners describe you as emotionally unavailable, distant, or like living with a roommate. You feel misunderstood from your perspective. You're there, you're committed, you're faithful. What more do they want? What they want is you, your actual interior experience, your vulnerability, your emotional presence. But that's precisely what the wound prevents. You use control to prevent the vulnerability that intimacy requires. You decide when you have sex, what you do on weekends, how money is spent, where you live, how the relationship works. You're not consciously tyrannical, you just need things your way, because that maintains the sense of safety and power that prevents vulnerability. When your partner expresses needs that would require you to adjust, compromise, or meet them emotionally, you experience it as attack or attempt to control you. You respond with resistance, anger, or withdrawal. Underneath, if you surrender control, you have to trust someone else with your well-being, and your wound says trust is dangerous, surrender is weakness, and vulnerability invites destruction. You unconsciously destroy good relationships right when they're getting deeper. You have an affair just as she's about to move in. You explode in rage and say unforgivable things right before she meets your family. You pick a massive fight about something minor right after she says, "I love you." Why? Because deep intimacy terrifies you more than being alone. Your unconscious creates crises that give you justification to leave. See, it wasn't working anyway. Or that create enough damage to ensure she leaves you, ensuring abandonment happens on your terms rather than surprising you later. You keep relationships in boxes: work life, social life, family life, romantic life, all separate, never integrated. Your partner doesn't really know your friends. Your colleagues don't know your partner. Your family gets edited versions of your life. This prevents anyone from seeing you completely. If each person only sees one aspect, no one can truly know you, which means no one can reject the complete you, judge the whole you, or leave you based on full understanding of who you are. The compartmentalizing feels like healthy boundaries, but it's actually fragmentation designed to prevent genuine intimacy. David was 38, in his third serious relationship, watching it follow the exact same pattern as the previous two. Initial intense connection, followed by his gradual withdrawal, followed by her increasing frustration, followed by explosive breakup where she tells him he's incapable of real intimacy, and he feels wronged and misunderstood. David grew up in a home where his mother was severely depressed and emotionally needy. From age 8 onward, he became her emotional support, listening to her problems, comforting her during breakdowns, managing her moods. His father was physically present but emotionally absent, working constantly and offering no model of healthy masculine emotional engagement. David learned, women's emotional needs are bottomless pits that will drain you completely. Caring for a woman means losing yourself. Your needs don't matter, you exist to meet hers. As an adult, David was attracted to strong, independent women. His wound logic, if she's strong and independent, She won't need me the way my mother did, so I'll be safe. But then, invariably, each woman would develop normal relational needs, wanting emotional presence, wanting him to share his interior experience, wanting genuine partnership rather than surface connection. And David would panic. His body would literally respond with anxiety when his girlfriend wanted to have relationship conversations. When she cried and needed comfort, he'd feel contemptuous irritation instead of compassion. His mother's endless tears had drained his capacity for empathy. When she wanted more of his time and attention, he'd feel suffocated and resentful, exactly how he felt with his enmeshed mother. His current girlfriend, Rebecca, had been trying for months to address the pattern. "You're amazing when everything's light and fun," she told him, "but the moment I need something from you emotionally, you shut down or get angry. I'm not your mother. I don't want to consume you. I just want a partner who's actually emotionally present." David knew she was right, but he didn't know how to change. In his mind, being emotionally present meant being overwhelmed and drained, the only model he had from childhood. In therapy, David did painful work excavating his mother wound. He realized he'd spent 30 years unconsciously treating every woman like his mother, expecting them to be bottomless pits of need, maintaining distance to protect himself from engulfment, experiencing their normal relational needs as threatening. He also confronted his father wound. Having never witnessed healthy masculine emotional presence, he didn't know what it looked like. He thought men were either emotionally absent, his father, or consumed by women's needs, what happened to him with his mother. He didn't know there was a third option, being emotionally present while maintaining healthy boundaries, meeting a partner's needs without losing yourself, being vulnerable without being consumed. The breakthrough came when David's therapist asked, what would it be like to choose a woman and actually let her in? Not halfway, not with one foot out the door, not maintaining escape routes, but actually surrendering to intimacy. David's immediate response was visceral panic. I'd disappear. I'd lose myself. I'd become what I was with my mother, just an emotional support system for someone else's needs. That's what the wounded boy believes, his therapist said. But you're not 8 years old anymore. You're a grown man who can maintain boundaries, who can say no, who can meet someone's needs without sacrificing yourself. The question is, are you willing to risk finding out that intimacy doesn't have to mean engulfment? David had to make a choice. Continue the pattern of distance and control that had destroyed every relationship, or risk genuine intimacy despite the terror it evoked. He chose intimacy. It was brutal. Every time Rebecca wanted emotional connection, David's system screamed at him to withdraw. He had to consciously override the protective mechanism that had been running automatically for 3 decades. He had to practice staying present when every cell wanted to flee. He had to learn that Rebecca's tears weren't his mother's, that comforting his girlfriend didn't mean drowning in her pain. He had to discover that vulnerability didn't equal weakness, and that being needed didn't mean being consumed. 2 years later, David and Rebecca were engaged. David described the transformation. I finally understand what people mean by intimacy. I thought it was just sex or spending time together. I didn't know it meant being actually known. Letting her see my fears, my wounds, my inadequacies, and discovering she doesn't leave or lose respect. She just loves me more completely because she's seeing me more completely. I spent 30 years running from the most valuable thing humans can experience, genuine connection. If you suspect you carry this wound, here are questions to reveal the pattern. Think about the moment in relationships when your partner wants to deepen emotional connection, wants to meet your family, wants to talk about the future, wants you to be more vulnerable, expresses that she loves you. What do you feel? What do you do? If the answer involves anxiety, withdrawal, picking fights, or sudden doubts about the relationship. Your wound is creating distance when intimacy increases. Look at your relationship history. What kind of people are you attracted to? Available or unavailable? Emotionally open or closed? Needing you or independent to the point of distance? Your choices reveal your wound. If you consistently choose unavailable people, you're unconsciously ensuring intimacy remains impossible. If you choose available people, then make them unavailable through your behavior, you're actively sabotaging what you claim to want. Complete this sentence honestly. If I let someone truly know me, then your answers reveal your wound's belief system. They'll reject me. They'll use my vulnerabilities against me. I'll lose myself. I'll be consumed. They'll leave once they see who I really am. These beliefs operate unconsciously, determining your behavior in relationships without you even realizing it. When you share something vulnerable, a fear, a wound, an inadequacy, is it genuine or strategic? Are you actually opening up, or are you carefully revealing controlled vulnerabilities designed to create the appearance of intimacy while maintaining your defenses? Real vulnerability means not knowing how the other person will respond and sharing anyway. Strategic vulnerability means maintaining control, even in the appearance of openness. For many men with intimacy wounds, genuine connection would require surrendering control, admitting you need someone, being seen in your weakness or fear, trusting that vulnerability won't be weaponized. These feel like intolerable costs. What specifically would genuine intimacy require you to give up? The answer reveals what the wound is protecting. This one is painful but essential. What words have multiple partners used to describe you? Distant, unavailable, controlling, unable to open up, afraid of commitment, like there's a wall around you? If multiple people who've been intimate with you describe similar patterns, believe them. They can see from the outside what you can't see from inside the wound. Not all intimacy wounds look the same. Jung recognized several patterns. The avoidant type. You maintain physical and emotional distance. You need lots of alone time, feel suffocated by too much togetherness, prefer relationships where you maintain separate lives that occasionally intersect. You value independence above connection and experience your partner's needs as demands or invasions. The anxious type. You're desperate for intimacy but terrified of it. You cling and push away simultaneously. You need constant reassurance but don't believe it when given. You're hypervigilant for signs of rejection or abandonment, often creating the very rejection you fear through controlling or desperate behavior. The disorganized type. You alternate between intense connection and complete withdrawal in unpredictable ways. You pursue intensely, then suddenly go cold. You're affectionate one day, distant the next. Your partner never knows which version of you they're getting, living in constant confusion about where they stand. The compartmentalized type. You can be intimate in specific domains, sexually, intellectually, practically, but completely closed in others, emotionally, vulnerably. You might have great sexual connection but zero emotional openness, or you might share thoughts but never feelings. All these patterns serve the same function, preventing the genuine intimacy that the wound has marked as dangerous. Jung had a specific understanding of why men struggle with intimacy that goes deeper than childhood wounding. He believed that men carry within them an unconscious feminine aspect he called the anima, the soul image, the inner woman, the gateway to emotional life, relational capacity, and the unconscious depths. When men are disconnected from their anima, often through masculine wounding that teaches them to reject anything feminine, they become incapable of genuine intimacy. Why? Because intimacy requires the capacities that live in the anima: emotional fluency, vulnerability, intuition, receptivity. the ability to be rather than constantly do. Men with intimacy wounds unconsciously project their anima onto women, seeking externally what they've lost internally. They choose partners hoping the woman will provide emotional connection, relational warmth, and access to feeling that they can't generate themselves. But projection doesn't work. You can't find in another person what you're missing in yourself. The woman becomes a screen for the man's internal feminine that he's exiled, and when she inevitably fails to be his soul, because she's a real person with her own needs, not an internal archetype, he withdraws in disappointment or anger. Jung's path to healing: integrate the anima, reclaim your own capacity for emotion, vulnerability, and relational depth. Stop projecting soul onto women and find it within. Then, and only then, can you engage in genuine intimacy, because you're bringing wholeness to meet wholeness rather than neediness hoping the other will complete you. David discovered this in his healing. His attraction to strong, independent women was actually anima projection. He was seeking in partners the strength and independence he couldn't find in himself because he'd confused emotional presence with weakness and engulfment. Once he integrated his own strength with emotional capacity, he could finally meet Rebecca as an equal rather than unconsciously making her responsible for the parts of himself he'd disowned. Healing requires doing what terrifies you, choosing genuine intimacy and staying present through the panic it creates. If you've been choosing unavailable partners, deliberately choose someone who's emotionally available and wants real connection. If you've been running when things get serious, commit to staying and working through the discomfort. This means making a conscious choice against your wound pattern. Your wound will scream that this is dangerous. Do it anyway. Start small. Share something real about your interior experience, not strategically, not with outcome in mind, but genuinely. Share a fear, admit an insecurity, reveal a wound. Let your partner see you in your imperfection. Notice what happens. Does she attack? Use it against you? Lose respect? Or does she actually move closer, appreciating the authenticity, loving you more fully because she's seeing you more completely? Most men discover that genuine vulnerability creates deeper intimacy, not the rejection they feared. But you have to risk it to find out. When your partner wants to discuss relationship issues or emotional needs, your wound will want to withdraw, get angry, or shut down. Practice staying present instead. This doesn't mean accepting abuse or having no boundaries. It means stay in the room, stay in your body, stay engaged, even though every cell wants to flee. Listen to what she actually needs, rather than what your wound fears she needs. You might discover that her needs aren't the bottomless pit you imagine. They're normal, reasonable, and actually fulfilling to meet when you're not approaching them from wounding. Do Jung's work of integrating your inner feminine. This might mean creative expression, art, music, writing that accesses feeling and intuition. Dream work with a Jungian therapist to encounter anima figures, active imagination, dialoguing with your internal feminine, deliberately developing emotional literacy, relational capacity, and vulnerability, challenging beliefs that these capacities are unmasculine or weak. The goal isn't to become feminine, it's to become whole by integrating the qualities you've exiled. Intimacy wounds live in the body. Practice physical presence and embodiment. Eye contact exercises where you simply gaze at your partner without speaking. Breathwork together that creates energetic connection. Non-sexual physical intimacy. Holding, being held, touching without agenda. Sex that's present rather than performative. Your body holds the wound memory. Healing requires creating new body memories of intimacy as safe rather than dangerous. If your intimacy wound stems from early attachment trauma, mother absence, mother enmeshment, childhood abuse, you'll likely need professional help. Attachment wounding is preverbal. It happened before you had language, so talk therapy alone often can't reach it. Consider attachment-focused therapy, somatic experiencing, EMDR, or other trauma modalities that work with the nervous system and body, not just cognition. Find or create men's groups where vulnerability is practiced. Many men with intimacy wounds can't be vulnerable with women, but can start learning with other men in safe container. Practice sharing authentically with other men, your fears, your wounds, your struggles. Learn that vulnerability doesn't equal weakness and that being witnessed doesn't lead to attack. Jung called the integration of masculine and feminine, both within the individual and between partners, the conjunctio, the sacred marriage. This wasn't just psychological theory, it was spiritual vision. He believed that genuine intimacy between whole individuals is one path to the numinous, the experience of the divine, the transcendent, the mystery that gives life meaning. Two people who can each access their full humanity, masculine and feminine, strength and vulnerability, independence and connection, can create in their union something that approaches the sacred. But this is only possible when both individuals have done their inner work. If you're carrying the intimacy wound, you can't participate in sacred union because you're bringing fragmentation rather than wholeness, defense rather than presence, fear rather than love. The wound keeps you trapped in relationships that are functional but not transformative, practical but not profound. You might have a marriage that provides stability, companionship, and partnership, but you'll never experience the depth of connection that humans are capable of when two souls actually meet without masks or defenses. David described his relationship with Rebecca after healing. "I didn't know intimacy could feel like this, not suffocating or terrifying, but like coming home, like being seen completely and loved anyway. No, loved more because she sees all of me. This is what I was running from my entire adult life. The very thing I was terrified of turns out to be the thing that makes life worth living." I need to be clear about something. Healing the intimacy wound doesn't guarantee your current relationship will survive. In fact, as you change, your relationship will either deepen or end. If your partner has been tolerating your distance and is capable of meeting you in deeper intimacy, the relationship will transform into something far more fulfilling for both of you. But if your partner has her own wounds that require distance, or if the relationship was built on dysfunction, your healing might mean it ends. Some relationships exist precisely because both people's wounds fit together. You need distance. She needs someone who won't truly see her. When you heal and want genuine intimacy, that incompatibility becomes clear. This is painful but necessary. The goal isn't to save any particular relationship. It's to become capable of genuine intimacy so that you can finally experience the depth of connection you were designed for, whether with your current partner or someone you haven't met yet. The intimacy wound offers you a choice, though the wound will make it feel like no choice at all. You can continue the pattern, maintaining distance, choosing unavailable partners, sabotaging when things get deep, living with the gnawing loneliness of being surrounded by people but known by none. Or you can risk it. You can choose someone and actually let them in. You can practice vulnerability despite terror. You can stay present through the panic. You can discover whether the wound's promise that intimacy means destruction is actually true or just the echo of childhood pain. Most men choose safety. They spend their entire lives maintaining protective distance, never knowing what genuine intimacy feels like, dying without ever being truly seen. Some men choose courage. They risk being known. They surrender control. They discover that vulnerability, far from destroying them, actually makes them more fully alive. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But the meeting can only happen if you show up. Not the persona, not the performance, not the protected version. The actual you, wounded, imperfect, vulnerable, real. Are you willing? Can you handle being truly known? Can you risk the intimacy you've spent your life avoiding? The answer to these questions will determine whether you experience genuine love or spend your life safely distant from it. The fourth spiritual sign that reveals silent wounds. Chronic, barely controlled anger that erupts disproportionately to triggers, or conversely, rage, that's completely suppressed and leaks out as passive aggression, sarcasm, or punishing withdrawal. Be honest with yourself. How close to the surface is your anger? Do you have road rage? Does someone cutting you off in traffic send you into fury that lasts 20 minutes? Where you're fantasizing about revenge or cursing them with intensity that feels briefly satisfying but leaves you drained? Do you explode over minor frustrations? Technology that doesn't work immediately, service that's not perfect, small mistakes that others make. Do these create disproportionate rage that shocks even you once you've calmed down? Do people walk on eggshells around your moods? Does your partner check your mood before approaching you with questions or needs? Do your children monitor your emotional state to avoid setting you off? Do colleagues avoid bringing you problems because they fear your reaction? Or is your anger inverted, swallowed, suppressed, turned inward? Do you experience chronic depression that feels like anger you won't let out? Do you make cutting remarks, use sarcasm as a weapon, or punish people through cold silence and withdrawal? Can you access anger appropriately, feeling it when it's warranted, expressing it cleanly without explosion or suppression, letting it move through you and dissipate? Or is anger either volcanic eruption or complete shutdown with nothing in between? If you recognize these patterns, you're carrying what Jung called the rage wound, anger that has become pathological because it's the guardian of deeper, more vulnerable emotions you've been forbidden to feel. Here's what most people don't understand about masculine anger. Rage is almost never the primary emotion. It's the secondary emotion, the one that covers terror, grief, shame, helplessness, and hurt. It's the guardian at the gate, preventing access to the vulnerable feelings underneath. From boyhood, men learn that anger is the only acceptable masculine emotion. Think about the messages. Boys don't cry, but they can get angry. Fear is weakness, but rage is strength. Sadness is pathetic, but fury is powerful. Vulnerability is contemptible, but aggression is masculine. Tenderness is feminine, but dominance is male. Watch how fathers, coaches, media, and culture respond to boys' emotions. Crying brings shame or dismissal. Fear brings contempt or attack. Sadness brings impatience or advice to toughen up. But anger is understood, even encouraged in certain contexts. Stand up for yourself. Don't let them push you around. Be a man. Fight back. By adolescence, most boys have learned to funnel every uncomfortable emotion through the one valve that remains socially acceptable. Rage. Hurt by a breakup? Get angry at her. Terrified of failure? Get angry at those judging you. Grieving a loss? Get angry at the universe. Feeling inadequate? Get angry at people who remind you of it. Overwhelmed by life? Get angry at everything. Jung understood this as emotional compression. All the feelings that have no outlet get compressed into the one emotion that feels masculine and powerful. There is a loneliness particular to men that no language has yet named. It is not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being surrounded by expectation, by performance, by the weight of 1,000 unspoken rules about what it means to stand upright in the world. From the first breath, the masculine soul is taught a doctrine of stone, to harden what is soft, to bury what is broken, to exile the inner world into a vault so deep that even he forgets the combination. This is not cruelty. This is initiation into a collective unconscious that has, for millennia, confused strength with silence and wholeness with invulnerability. Carl Jung understood this with the clarity of one who had descended into his own depths and returned with maps. He saw that the persona, the mask we wear to meet the world, becomes for men not merely a face but a fortress. And within that fortress, the soul does not rest. It paces, it whispers, it wounds itself against the walls, trying to be heard. The masculine psyche, shaped by centuries of warrior codes and stoic ideals, learns early that vulnerability is not a doorway, but a trapdoor, a passage downward into shame, rejection, and the unbearable terror of being seen as weak. And so the boy becomes the man by learning to carry his wounds in silence, to transmute his longing into labor, to perform his way out of the abyss of his own feeling. But the wound does not disappear because it is unnamed. It does not heal because it is hidden. It becomes the architecture of the life. It becomes the invisible hand that shapes every choice, every relationship, every moment of exhaustion disguised as ambition. Jung called this the shadow, the part of ourselves we refuse to see, the aspect of our being we cast into darkness because it does not fit the story we have been told to live. And for men, the shadow is vast. It is an ocean of unexpressed grief, unmet longing, and disowned tenderness. It is the repository of every tear never cried, every fear never named, every softness exiled in the name of survival. This chapter is an unveiling. It is a descent beneath the armor to witness the wounds that shape a man's destiny, often without his knowing. These are not pathologies, they are sacred symptoms, soul languages crying out from beneath the stone. And the first wound, the most pervasive, is the wound of worthlessness, hidden beneath the compulsion to achieve. From boyhood, the masculine soul learns that his value is not inherent, it is earned. He is not loved for being, he is loved for doing. The father's approval comes not with presence, but with performance. The mother's pride is tied to grades, to trophies, to the visible markers of success. The world does not ask him who he is. It asks him what he has accomplished. And so the soul learns a quiet, corrosive equation. I am what I achieve. If I stop, I am nothing. This is not ambition. This is terror disguised as drive. Beneath every relentless pursuit, beneath every sleepless night spent grinding toward the next milestone, there is a boy who believes that if he pauses, if he rests, if he dares to simply exist without producing, the love will vanish. The validation will evaporate. The world will see through him and discover the unbearable truth that he is not enough. Jung saw this clearly. The inflation of the ego through achievement is a defense against the void within. The man builds empires not because he desires them, but because he fears the silence that would rush in if he stopped building. He measures his worth in metrics because he cannot trust the immeasurable, the quiet, steady presence of a soul that needs no resume to justify its existence. And yet, the wound is not in the achievement itself. The wound is in the belief that without it, he dissolves. The wound is in the exhaustion that has become so normalized he no longer recognizes it as suffering. The wound is in the moment he finally reaches the summit and feels nothing. Because the void was never meant to be filled from the outside. It was meant to be faced. The second wound emerges from the same darkness, the fear of stillness. For the masculine psyche, stillness is not peace, it is confrontation. To stop moving is to stop distracting. To stop producing is to stop defending. And in the stillness, the voices rise, the doubts, the grief, the unbearable weight of everything that has been postponed, ignored, buried beneath busyness. Jung understood that the modern man fears the unconscious more than he fears death, because the unconscious holds everything he has refused to become. It holds the questions he has not asked, the feelings he has not felt, the life he has not lived. And so he runs. He fills every moment with motion, work, screens, substances, noise. He mistakes exhaustion for living. He mistakes distraction for resilience. But the soul does not forget. It keeps calling him toward the stillness, toward the moment where he must finally sit with himself and ask, who am I when I am not performing? What remains when the armor falls away? And this is where the wound reveals its deeper truth, that the fear of stillness is, at its core, a fear of emptiness. The man has built his entire identity around external motion, around roles and achievements and the opinions of others. He has not yet learned to meet himself in the silence. He has not yet discovered that beneath the void is not nothingness, but the self, the true, unshakable core of his being that exists independent of the world's validation. The third wound is perhaps the most misunderstood, the rage that masks sorrow. Men are permitted anger in a way they are not permitted grief. Anger is strength. Anger is power. Anger is the socially acceptable face of pain. And so the masculine soul learns to channel every ache, every loss, every moment of helplessness into a clenched fist, a raised voice, a wall of fury that keeps the world at bay. Jung called this enantiodromia, the tendency of the psyche to swing into its opposite when one pole is overemphasized. When sorrow is forbidden, it does not disappear, it transforms. It becomes the explosion at the dinner table, the cold withdrawal after an argument, the simmering resentment that poisons intimacy. Beneath every man's rage is a river of unshed tears. Beneath every outburst is a boy who was told that crying was weakness, that feeling was failure, that the only acceptable response to pain was to fight or to flee. And so he learned to armor his heart with anger, to transmute his vulnerability into volatility, to push away the very tenderness he craves, because to reach for it would mean admitting how deeply he has been wounded. The rage is not the problem. The rage is the symptom. It is the soul's way of saying, I am in pain and I do not know how to name it. And until a man learns to meet his own sorrow, not as an enemy but as a teacher, not as a weakness but as a sacred vulnerability, he will continue to burn. He will continue to hurt the people he loves, not because he is cruel, but because he has never been taught that there is another way to hold pain. He will continue to live at the mercy of his own unprocessed grief, a prisoner of emotions he refuses to feel. The fourth wound lives in the spaces between control and chaos, the addiction to control born from childhood powerlessness, the boy who grew up in an unpredictable home, where love was conditional, where safety was uncertain, where he could not trust the adults to hold the world together, becomes a man who cannot tolerate the uncontrollable. He micromanages, he plans obsessively, he builds systems and structures and routines that keep chaos at bay, not because he is rigid, but because he is terrified. Beneath the need for control is the memory of a time when he had none, when he was small and the world was large, and the people who were supposed to protect him could not even protect themselves. Jung understood that the psyche seeks to balance what was unbalanced in childhood. The boy who felt helpless becomes the man who grips life with white knuckles, determined never to feel that helplessness again. But control is an illusion. Life is, by its nature, uncontrollable, and the more tightly a man holds, the more brittle he becomes. The more he tries to orchestrate every outcome, the more he suffocates the spontaneity, the aliveness, the very flow that makes existence bearable. The wound is not in the desire for order. The wound is in the belief that without total control, he will shatter. The wound is in the inability to trust himself, others, the process of life itself. And so he lives in a state of perpetual vigilance, exhausting himself trying to hold together a world that was never meant to be held. He does not yet know that surrender is not collapse. He does not yet understand that letting go is not losing, it is liberation. The fifth wound is the quietest and perhaps the most insidious, the relentless pursuit of external validation to silence the inner critic. Deep within the masculine psyche lives a voice that is never satisfied. It is the voice of the father who was never proud enough, the coach who demanded more, the culture that taught him he must always be better, stronger, more. It is the internalized judge that turned self-reflection into self-annihilation, that transformed growth into a never-ending gauntlet of inadequacy. And because that voice is so loud, so relentless, the man learns to seek silence not through self-compassion, but through the approval of others. He needs the promotion to prove he is worthy. He needs the partner's admiration to prove he is lovable. He needs the likes, the accolades, the visible markers of success to drown out the critic within. But external validation is water poured into a broken vessel. It never stays. No amount of praise can heal the wound of self-rejection. No achievement can silence the voice that was installed long before he had the language to question it. Jung called this the tyranny of the superego, the part of the psyche that has swallowed the collective's expectations whole and now enforces them with brutal precision. The wound here is not that the man seeks validation. It is that he has forgotten how to validate himself. He has outsourced his sense of worth to a world that will never give him permission to rest. He has abandoned the inner authority, the quiet, steady knowing of his own soul, in favor of a hall of mirrors where he endlessly seeks his reflection in others' eyes. And this is the loneliest prison of all, to be surrounded by approval and still feel empty because the only voice that truly matters, the only validation that can heal, is the one he has never learned to offer himself. These 5 wounds, the compulsion to achieve, the fear of stillness, the rage that masks sorrow, the addiction to control, and the pursuit of external validation are not separate. They are threads in the same tapestry, woven together by a culture that taught men to exile their humanity in the name of strength. They are the architecture of the masculine shadow, the invisible scaffolding that holds up a life built on performance rather than presence. They are the soul's way of saying, "You have forgotten who you are beneath the armor." But here is the sacred truth Jung spent his life illuminating. The wound is not the end of the story, it is the beginning. Every symptom is a summons. Every fracture is a doorway. The armor was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be outgrown. And the moment a man begins to recognize these wounds, not as failures but as invitations, he steps onto the path of individuation. He begins the descent that will ultimately lead him home to himself. The fortress begins to crack, and through the cracks, the light gets in. There comes a moment in every man's life when the armor he has worn so faithfully begins to feel less like protection and more like a tomb. It is not a dramatic moment, not an explosion or a revelation written in fire across the sky. It is quieter than that. It is the exhaustion that no longer lifts after a night's sleep. It is the hollow victory, the achievement that tastes like ash. It is the sudden, unsettling awareness that he has been living someone else's life, performing someone else's script, and that the soul beneath the stone is dying for want of air. Jung called this the nigredo, the blackening, the first stage of alchemical transformation, where everything must be reduced to its essence before it can be reborn. And for men, this descent is not a choice. It is a necessity. The wound does not heal by being ignored. It heals by being witnessed. And the witnessing begins when the armor finally cracks. This is the first threshold, the collapse of the false warrior. For so long, the masculine psyche has equated strength with endurance, with the capacity to carry infinite weight without breaking. The man has learned to soldier through pain, through doubt, through the quiet erosion of his own aliveness. He has learned to see vulnerability not as a human condition, but as a moral failure, a weakness to be conquered rather than a truth to be held. And so he pushes. He drives himself harder. He tells himself that rest is for the weak, that feeling is indulgent, that to admit he is struggling would be to betray every man who came before him and bore his burden in silence. But the body keeps the score. The psyche keeps the ledger. And eventually, the false warrior collapses, not because he is weak, but because he is human. The breakdown may come as illness, as the sudden failure of the physical form that has been pushed beyond its limits. It may come as depression, as the slow draining of color from a life that once held meaning. It may come as a crisis, the end of a marriage, the loss of a career, the moment when everything he built to prove his worth crumbles and he is left standing in the ruins, asking the question he has spent a lifetime avoiding. Who am I when I am not performing? This collapse is not a failure, it is an initiation. Jung understood that the ego must be humbled before the self can emerge. The persona must shatter before the true face can be seen. And in the wreckage of the false warrior, something sacred is finally given permission to speak. The soul's exhaustion, the body's truth, the quiet, desperate longing to be known rather than admired, to be loved rather than useful, to simply exist without having to earn the right to take up space. This is the moment when a man stops running from his own humanity and begins haltingly to turn toward it. The collapse asks him to do the unthinkable, to stop, to sit with the wreckage, to feel the feelings he has spent decades outrunning, to admit that he does not have all the answers, that he cannot fix everything, that he is, in fact, broken, and that brokenness is not the opposite of wholeness, but the path toward it. This is where the healing begins, not in the striving, but in the surrender, not in the armor, but in the vulnerability that the armor was always meant to protect. The false warrior dies so that the true man can be born, but the collapse is only the beginning. The second threshold waiting in the darkness is perhaps the most difficult for the masculine psyche to cross. The return of the exiled feminine. In Jungian terms, this is the integration of the anima, the inner feminine, the aspect of the soul that has been cast into shadow because it did not fit the narrow definition of masculinity the world demanded. For most men, the feminine has been exiled since boyhood. Tenderness was weakness. Intuition was foolishness. Emotion was chaos. The capacity to receive, to rest, to feel without fixing, to be still without producing, all of this was deemed unacceptable, dangerous, a threat to the masculine identity that must be built on doing rather than being. And so the man learned to live in one half of himself. He learned to operate entirely in the realm of logos, logic, structure, control, action. He mastered the external world while abandoning the internal one. He became efficient, capable, strong, and utterly disconnected from the wisdom of his own depths. Jung saw this imbalance as the root of modern man's suffering. When the masculine is overemphasized and the feminine is repressed, the psyche becomes rigid, brittle, unable to adapt to the flow of life. The man becomes a machine. He loses access to the very qualities that make intimacy possible, that make creativity flourish, that make life feel lived rather than endured. The return of the exiled feminine is not about becoming less of a man. It is about becoming more fully human. It is the reclamation of tenderness, not as weakness, but as the courage to be gentle in a world that valorizes hardness. It is the restoration of intuition, the ability to trust the knowing that comes not from analysis but from the body's wisdom, from the soul's quiet certainty. It is the permission to feel without shame, to cry, to grieve, to express the full spectrum of emotion without believing that each tear is a betrayal of manhood. It is the capacity to receive, love, help, care, without needing to immediately reciprocate, to prove worthiness, to earn what is being freely given. This threshold asks the man to unlearn almost everything he was taught. It asks him to soften where he was told to harden, to open where he was told to close, to trust the inner voice that speaks in whispers, rather than the outer world that shouts its demands. It is the recognition that the feminine is not the opposite of the masculine, but its complement, its balance, the missing half that makes wholeness possible. And until a man can embrace this, until he can hold both strength and tenderness, action and receptivity, logic and intuition within the same body, he will remain divided against himself, at war with the very parts of his soul that long to come home. The integration of the anima is where true intimacy becomes possible, because a man who has exiled his own feminine cannot truly meet another's. He cannot be present to emotion because he is terrified of his own. He cannot receive love because he has never learned to believe he deserves it without earning it. He cannot rest in connection because he is always performing, always defending, always holding himself at a distance to avoid the vulnerability that intimacy demands. But the man who has reclaimed his inner feminine, who has learned to feel, to soften, to trust the wisdom of his own depths, becomes capable of a love that is no longer a transaction but a communion. He becomes capable of being, not just doing, of presence, not just performance. The third threshold is the one most men spend a lifetime circling but rarely cross: the confrontation with the father wound. Jung understood that we do not merely inherit our parents' traits, we inherit their unlived lives, their unprocessed traumas, their silent sufferings. The father wound is not always about abuse or absence, though it can be. More often it is about what was missing, the emotional presence that was never offered, the affirmation that was withheld, the vulnerability that was never modeled. The father who was himself a product of the same system, who learned to be a provider but not a presence, a protector but not a person, who passed down not cruelty but a legacy of silence. This wound runs deep because it is generational. It is the accumulated grief of men who were never taught to feel, never given permission to be soft, never shown that their worth was inherent rather than earned. And the son inherits this wound not through words, but through absence, the absence of emotional language, the absence of tender touch, the absence of a father who could say, "I am proud of you not for what you do, but for who you are." The boy grows into a man carrying the unspoken expectations of every father before him, living not his own life, but the unlived dreams and unmet needs of the lineage. The confrontation with the father wound is an act of profound courage. It requires the man to see his father not as a monolith, but as a human being, flawed, wounded, shaped by the same forces that now shape the son. It requires forgiveness, not as a pardon, but as a release, the letting go of the expectation that the father will ever become what he was never equipped to be. It requires grief for the childhood that was not had, for the connection that was not formed, for the love that was present but could never be expressed in the language the son needed to hear. But the deepest work of this threshold is not about the father at all. It is about the son's liberation from the father's script. It is the moment he realizes he has been living in response to approval he will never receive, chasing validation from a man who could not give it to himself, measuring his worth against standards that were never his own. The father wound heals not when the father changes, But when the son stops waiting for permission to live his own life, when he stops needing the father's blessing to become himself, when he finally, courageously stands in his own authority and says, "I am not you. I will not repeat your patterns. I will break the chain." This is ancestral healing. This is the moment when the legacy of silence ends, when the son becomes the father he needed, first to himself, and then, if he chooses, to the next generation. He becomes the man who can feel, who can speak, who can be present in the ways his own father could not. He transforms the wound into wisdom, the absence into awareness, the pain into purpose, and this leads to the final threshold, the culmination of the journey, individuation. Jung spent his life mapping this process, the becoming of oneself, the emergence of the true self from beneath the layers of conditioning, expectation, and inherited trauma. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not the pursuit of an idealized version of the self. It is the opposite. It is the stripping away of everything that is not authentically, irreducibly him. It is the courage to stop living someone else's script and to begin authoring his own destiny. This is where the silent wounds reveal their ultimate purpose. They were never meant to destroy him. They were meant to redirect him away from the false life, the performed identity, the armor that protected him as a boy, but now imprisons him as a man. Every wound was a signpost pointing toward the unlived life, the disowned self, the aspects of his being that were exiled in the name of survival, but that hold the key to his becoming. The compulsion to achieve was pointing toward the need to find inherent worth. The fear of stillness was pointing toward the courage to face the unconscious. The rage was pointing toward the grief that needed to be felt. The addiction to control was pointing toward the trust that needed to be cultivated. The pursuit of validation was pointing toward the self-acceptance that could only come from within. Individuation is the alchemical fire where all of this is transformed. It is the process of integrating the shadow, of reclaiming the exiled parts, of becoming whole not by perfection but by integration. The individuated man is not free from wounds. He is free because of them. He has met his darkness and found it was not an enemy but a teacher. He has descended into his depths and discovered that beneath the void was not nothingness but the self, vast, unshakable, eternal. He has learned to hold paradox, to be strong and tender, driven and at peace, independent and deeply connected. He has learned that his destiny was never about becoming someone else. It was always about becoming more fully himself. These 4 thresholds, the collapse of the false warrior, the return of the exiled feminine, the confrontation with the father wound, and the journey of individuation, are not linear. They spiral. A man will cross them many times in many forms throughout his life. Each time he sheds another layer of armor. Each time he becomes more real. And in that becoming, he discovers the truth Jung spent his life illuminating, that the wound was never a curse. It was an invitation. The silent suffering was never meaningless. It was the soul's way of calling him home. And the man who dares to descend, who dares to feel, who dares to become, he is not diminished. He is forged. The silent wound becomes the sacred scar, and the scar becomes the seal of his authenticity, the mark of a man who has been broken and has chosen to become whole. This is not the end of suffering. It is the transformation of suffering into meaning. And in that transformation, he finally fully becomes alive.